Hi everyone, I am Dream Into Wealth. I know people watching this are trying to fall asleep. How are you? And I hope you are okay in life. Listen to my story and make yourself comfortable. Also, if y'all like this kind of stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The long trail of Amos Whitaker out, where the plains stretched so wide they near touched the sky, there lived a man named Amos Whitaker. He wasn't no gunslinger, no outlaw, not even a ranch baron with herds blotting the horizon. He was just a wiry fellow with a steady gaze and the quiet patience of a man who'd seen too many winters to rush at life. Amos had been a ranch hand most of his days, mending fences, driving cattle, and working under men who measured success in head count and acres. But Amos had something different in his bones. He believed true wealth wasn't in the size of your herd, but in the way you managed what you had. Most hands, come payday, spent their wages quick, whiskey, cards, or boots they didn't need. Amos, he'd sit by the fire, roll his pay in a small cloth pouch and tuck it away. "A dollar saved is a fence post set," he'd mutter. Nobody listened much. They figured he was just a miser, too tight-fisted to enjoy his own sweat. But Amos was studying. Nights, when the bunkhouse quieted, he'd pore over old newspapers, learning about cattle prices, grain costs, and even bank rates. He'd trace the ups and downs like a trail map, seeing patterns others ignored. His fellow cowhands laughed, saying the market weren't no place for a ranch hand. But Amos kept steady, learning that patience and foresight were the real tools of wealth. His break came one dry summer when drought scorched the prairie. Cattle prices plummeted, ranchers selling herds cheap just to keep water in their wells. Amos saw opportunity. He pooled together his savings, small though they were, and bought a dozen head at a fraction of their worth. Folks called him foolish. What good were half-starved cows in a dying land? But Amos had watched the weather, seen the clouds gathering different that year. He believed the rains would come, and when they did, he'd have cattle ready to fatten on fresh grass. Sure enough, by autumn, storms rolled in, rivers swelled, and pastures turned green again. Amos' thin herd grew sleek, and when winter markets rose, he sold for triple his cost. That was the seed. He didn't buy a mansion or flaunt his coin. He bought more head, leased a small pasture, and started working for himself. It weren't easy. Nights he slept under the stars, fighting wolves and mending his own fences. But every dollar went back into building something steady. Over time, Amos built not just a herd, but a way of thinking that spread quiet through the territory. He showed younger hands how to track prices, how to save wages, how to see value where others saw ruin. He'd tell them, money like cattle, you can't just drive it wild. You gotta guide it, let it grow, and protect it from rustlers. As his wealth grew, Amos did something unexpected. He built a schoolhouse. Not a fancy one, just timber walls, a roof, and a bell. But in that room, children of ranchers and drifters alike learned numbers, reading, and how markets work. Amos believed knowledge was the greatest herd a man could raise. There came a time when the railroads pushed deeper west, changing everything. Land values shifted, trade routes opened, and fortunes were made overnight. Many ranchers rushed to sell, afraid of taxes and new laws. But Amos, he studied carefully. Instead of selling, he leased sections of his land to the railroad itself, collecting steady payments while still running cattle on nearby ranges. It was a quiet move, but it turned his modest spread into a steady stream of wealth. He didn't gamble, didn't chase risky ventures. He just held steady, letting time do the heavy lifting. His neighbors, once skeptical, started coming by to ask advice. Amos never charged, just poured coffee and shared what he knew, save steady, spend wise, and let patience do its work. By the time Amos Whitaker was an old man, his name had become something of a legend, not for shootouts or riches flaunted, but for the way he lived. Modest cabin, simple meals, and a reputation built on fairness. His herd numbered in the thousands, his land stretched wide, and his investments in railroads, mills, and banks paid more than he could ever spend. But he never saw wealth as an end. He saw it as a tool to keep families fed through hard winters, to build schools and churches, to give young ranch hands a chance to rise above just day wages. When he passed, folks gathered from counties around, not to mourn, but to tell stories. Stories of a man who'd shown them that finance weren't just numbers on paper. It was the way you managed your life, your choices, and your future. And as rain pattered against windows that night, folks swore they could hear his voice on the wind. Wealth ain't what you hoard, but what you grow steady and share wide. The echo of Amos' trail. After Amos Whitaker passed on, folks said the land felt quieter, like the prairie itself had paused to tip its hat. But Amos didn't leave just cattle and land behind. He left ways of thinking, lessons stitched into the minds of ranch hands, neighbors, and school children who'd grown under his watch. One of those youngsters was a boy named Elijah Boone. Elijah had sat in Amos' schoolhouse when he was no taller than a saddle horn. He'd listened close when Amos talked about money flowing like rivers and how a man had to learn where those rivers were running if he wanted to drink deep. Unlike most kids who daydreamed about riding wild broncs, Elijah dreamed of books, numbers, and tall buildings in faraway towns. By the time Elijah was a young man, the territory was changing fast. Oil had been struck in patches of Texas and Oklahoma, and men were rushing in like bees to honey. Fortunes rose and fell overnight, and the chaos of it all lured dreamers from every corner of the frontier. Now, most ranchers steered clear of oil. Too messy, too risky, and too far from what they knew. But Elijah remembered Amos' steady voice. Don't fear the new. Study it, learn it, then move when the time right. So Elijah didn't rush. He worked odd jobs, saved every dollar, and read every newspaper he could get his hands on. He even traveled to Dallas once just to sit in the back of a banker office watching men haggle over oil leases like they were cattle contracts. It was on a rainy autumn evening that Elijah made his move. He'd saved enough to buy a small patch of land folks had written off as worthless, rocky soil, poor grazing. But Elijah wasn't buying for cattle. He'd studied maps, listened to whispers, and knew the ground beneath had oil veins running shallow. Sure enough, within a year, a driller struck black gold on that very plot. Neighbors thought it was pure luck, but Elijah knew it was patience, Amos' way of letting time and knowledge do the heavy lifting. With that strike, Elijah could have sold out and lived high, like many did. But he remembered Amos sitting by the fire, warning against squandering quick riches. So Elijah reinvested. He bought more land, not for cattle, but for leases. He let oil companies do the dirty work while he collected steady payments, just like Amos had done with the railroad years before. Now, wealth poured in faster than Elijah ever imagined, but instead of letting it drown him, he channeled it. He built a bank in the nearest town, not a grand marble hall, but a sturdy brick building where farmers, ranchers, and shopkeepers could deposit their earnings without fear of being cheated. On the wall, he hung a framed photo of Amos Whitaker, the man who'd shown him another way to measure success. Elijah Bank became more than a place for coin. It became a hub for advice, for loans given fair, for investments in mills, schools, and even roads. Folks started saying Elijah didn't just drill for oil, he drilled for opportunity, pulling wealth out of places most had overlooked. But Elijah wasn't the only one carrying Amos' torch. There was Clara Jensen, the daughter of a poor trapper who'd wandered into Amos' schoolhouse years ago with shoes near falling apart. Amos had taught her numbers, same as anyone else, but he'd also told her this: a sharp mind, like a sharp knife, don't leave it rusting in a drawer. Clara took that to heart. When she grew older, Clara didn't marry into a ranch like most expected. Instead, she opened a general store in a small town near the foothills. At first, it was just sacks of flour, salt, and beans. But Clara watched trade routes, studied rail schedules, and slowly expanded her stock. She carried tools, cloth, and even ledger books for ranchers trying to keep track of their accounts. Her store became a crossroads of commerce, and soon she opened 2 more in nearby towns. With profits, she invested in a grain mill, then a small freight company. Before long, folks were whispering that Clara Jensen was the most successful merchant in 3 counties, and she never forgot to credit Amos for planting the seed. Together, Elijah and Clara and a dozen others who'd once sat on hard benches in that little schoolhouse began changing the territory. Where once the land had been only ranches and dust, towns began to thrive with banks, mills, schools, and stores, all built not on quick greed but on Amos' lessons, patience, steady investment, and the belief that wealth should flow through a community, not just pile up in one man's pocket. The old-timers at the saloon would shake their heads, saying, "This new world too fast, too complicated." But others would answer, "Nah, it's just Amos' trail carrying on, only now the herd made of ideas, not cattle." Years rolled by, and soon Amos' name wasn't just remembered in dusty stories. It was carved into stone. A school was named after him. The bank Elijah built bore his portrait in the main hall. Clara freight wagons carried his motto painted on their sides: "Wealth ain't what you hoard, but what you grow steady and share wide." Even when the Great Panic hit in the 1890s and banks failed across the nation, Elijah Bank held steady. Folks said it was because he'd been taught never to gamble with money that wasn't his. And while other towns starved, his community pulled through, lean but unbroken. By the time the 20th century dawned, Amos Whitaker's legacy had spread far beyond cattle trails. His students had become bankers, merchants, oilmen, and teachers. And though each carved their own path, they carried the same compass: patience, discipline, and generosity. And so it was said that Amos never truly died. His campfire kept burning in the choices of every man and woman who believed wealth was something you built steady, tended careful, and shared wide. The steel rails and the stock ticker. By the time the 1900s rolled around, the wide prairies Amos once roamed had iron veins stretched across Anal, railroads crisscrossing like stitches sewing the nation together. Steam whistles echoed where coyotes once howled, and factories rose in towns that used to be no more than a saloon and a water trough. Amos' pupils, now older and seasoned, found themselves facing a new world. Elijah Boone oil fields were pumping steady. Clara Jensen freight wagons were humming along, and both of them knew the game had shifted. It wasn't just about cattle or oil anymore. It was about industry: steel, coal, electricity, and the hum of machines. Some folks were scared stiff of it. They said it was too big, too fast, too far removed from the honest sweat of the ranch. But Elijah and Clara remembered the way Amos had warned them: the world changes, and you can either complain about the dust or learn how to ride the wind it kicks up. So they leaned into the wind. Elijah took some of his oil profits and bought stock in a company laying new steel rails across the Midwest. He didn't jump in blind. No, sir. He traveled to Pittsburgh, sat in smoky offices, and asked questions until even the slickest businessmen got uncomfortable. Then, when he was satisfied the company was solid, he put in his money. For years, dividends rolled in like the tide, steady and strong. Folks in town whispered that Elijah must have struck luck twice in a lifetime. But he'd shake his head, sitting on the bank porch with his pipe, and murmur, "Luck just the name people give patience when they don't understand it." Clara, meanwhile, saw opportunity in the way goods were moving. Railroads could move freight faster than wagons ever could, and she knew her freight company would be left in the dust if she didn't adapt. So she sold her wagons, every last one, and bought shares in a new shipping line that worked hand in hand with the railroads. Some townsfolk thought she'd lost her mind. "Clara, you're throwing away a sure thing," they said. But within 5 years, her stake in that shipping line made her more money than her wagons ever could. And she wasn't just wealthier, she was freer. Her time spent advising, investing, and teaching younger merchants who came seeking her wisdom. Then came the stock ticker. For the first time, a man or woman could sit in an office hundreds of miles from the action and watch the rise and fall of fortunes roll across a strip of paper. It was like hearing hoofbeats of invisible herds stampeding through cities far away. Elijah was cautious. He'd seen too many dreamers gamble everything on rumors, but he also knew there was power in understanding the flow of that ticker tape. So he hired a young clerk, a bookish fellow named Martin, to track the numbers day by day, writing them into ledgers and comparing them against the weather, harvests, and rail schedules. Before long, Elijah could spot patterns others missed. He didn't gamble. He invested steady, just like Amos had taught, never more than he could afford to lose, never on a hunch, always on knowledge. And while some speculators went bust, Elijah's fortune grew slow but certain. Now Clara, on the other hand, didn't trust the ticker much. She preferred things she could see and touch, but she wasn't blind to the way the world was tilting. So she partnered with Elijah, letting him handle the ticker while she expanded into mills, warehouses, and even electricity plants that lit up towns after sundown. Together, they built something more than businesses. They built a network, a web of trust, investment, and opportunity that stretched across counties and states. And all of it, every brick, beam, and barrel, could be traced back to that old campfire where Amos Whitaker first spun his lessons about patience, discipline, and char and prosperity. But the turn of the century wasn't all bright lights and prosperity. Trouble brewed, same as it always did. The panic of 1907 hit like a dry wind before a storm. Banks toppled, stock markets crashed, and men who thought themselves kings were begging in the streets. Elijah's bank shook, but it didn't fall. Why? Because Amos' voice still echoed in his ears. Don't loan money to men who bet it all on a roll of the dice. Loan it to men who plant seeds. So Elijah's depositors stayed safe, and while other banks slammed their doors shut, his kept the lantern burning. Clara Mills stayed open too, because she'd built them on practical needs: grain, flour, and goods folks couldn't live without, even in hard times. While the rest of the country clawed at the dirt, their town stood steady, like a lone oak in a prairie storm. Years later, when folks looked back, they realized something. Amos hadn't just taught his students how to make money. He taught them how to survive storms. Wealth, he'd said, was more than numbers on a ledger. It was resilience, community, and having something that lasts when the winds shift. And so, in the flicker of oil lamps and the clatter of typewriters, his legacy lived on, in the rails that cut across the land, in the stock tickers chattering like cicadas, and in the steady heartbeat of towns that refused to fall. The roar of the 20s. By the time the 1920s dawned, the world felt like it had been reborn. The Great War was over, and though it left scars deep and raw, folks were hungry for life again. Cities pulsed with new energy, radios crackled with jazz, and the automobile turned dusty country lanes into ribbons of opportunity. Elijah Boone was gray now, his once lean frame softened by years of sitting behind ledgers instead of saddles, but his mind still sharp as a steel spur. He watched the world rush forward, cars, airplanes, electric lights bright enough to turn midnight into midday, and he couldn't help but smile. Clara Jensen, too, had silver streaks in her hair, though her step was spry and her eyes fierce. She managed her businesses with the same steel backbone she had when she first traded her wagons for stock shares. Her warehouses now stretched along riversides, filled with goods that railroads and trucks ferried to every corner of the country. But they both knew a storm was brewing, even in all the noise and sparkle of the jazz age. It started with speculation. Young men in bowler hats crowded around ticker tape machines, hollering and cheering as if the stock market was a prize fight. Ordinary folks who once kept their money in biscuit tins or under mattresses now begged banks for loans to buy shares of companies they'd never heard of. Elijah shook his head. "They're treating the market like a saloon dice game," he muttered one evening, puffing on his pipe. He remembered Amos' words clear as day. The fastest way to lose a fortune is to chase the glitter instead of the gold. So he kept steady. Invested in railroads, utilities, and farmland, things that fed people, moved goods, and lit homes. Clara did the same. When asked why she didn't join the rush, she'd laugh, her voice like gravel over whiskey. "Because I like sleeping at night," she'd say, "and I don't trust a fortune that can vanish between sunset and sunrise." One of their protégés, a young lawyer named Samuel, wasn't so cautious. He'd grown up hearing Amos' lessons but thought himself cleverer, sharper, quicker. "The old ways are too slow," he told Elijah one afternoon. "This is a new age. You can double your money in weeks, not years." Elijah just tapped the ashes from his pipe. "Son, I hope you're right," he said softly, "but I've seen too many men running after quicksilver. They come back empty-handed every time." Samuel didn't listen. He plunged headfirst into speculation, borrowing money to buy stock on margin, confident he was riding a wave that could never crash. For a while, he was right. He strutted through town in new suits, driving an automobile that gleamed like a silver bullet. Folks admired him, envied him, whispered that maybe the old guard had finally been outpaced. But Clara and Elijah knew better. Then came 1929. The ticker machines rattled like they were possessed. Stocks that had soared sky high tumbled like loose shingles in a storm. Panic spread, first in whispers, then in screams. Banks slammed their doors, factories shut down, and bread lines curled around city blocks. Elijah's investments shrank some, sure, but his foundations held. His money was in farms that still grew wheat, railroads that still hauled coal, and companies that made things people couldn't live without. Clara warehouses stayed full, though the flow slowed to a trickle. She cut her own salary, sold off luxuries, and kept her workers employed when other business owners tossed theirs to the curb. But Samuel, his fortune vanished overnight. His shiny automobile was repossessed, his house foreclosed, his name whispered not with envy but pity. He came to Elijah's porch one evening, broken, his hat in his hands. "I didn't listen," he admitted, voice raw. "I thought I was smarter than patience." Elijah didn't scold. He just nodded and poured the young man a glass of bourbon. "Failure a hard teacher," he said, "but if you learn from it, she's worth the price." As the Great Depression deepened, Elijah and Clara became pillars of their community. They didn't just preserve their fortunes, they preserved dignity. They opened soup kitchens, lent money without interest to struggling farmers, and kept the bank lanterns lit long after sundown so folks knew there was still a place they could turn to. And though the world felt like it was coming apart, Amos' campfire wisdom burned steady in their hearts. They passed it down, not just in words but in actions. Patience in the face of panic, discipline when the world screamed for excess, generosity when greed had drained the land dry. Years later, when the nation clawed its way out of the Depression, townsfolk told stories about how their little community had endured. They said it was because of Elijah Boone, who never let fear dictate his investments. They said it was because of Clara Jensen, who built warehouses that became lifelines when times were lean. But Elijah and Clara knew the truth. The credit didn't belong to them alone. It belonged to Amos Whitaker, that old cowboy whose voice still seemed to echo in every decision they made. "Wealth ain't measured in gold or paper," he'd said long ago, sitting by the fire. "It measured in how well you weather the storms and in how many folks you help stand when the storm passes." And so the legend carried on, not in ledgers or bank vaults, but in hearts that remembered the war years. By the time the 1940s rolled around, the world was once again holding its breath. The echoes of the Great Depression hadn't yet faded when the rumble of another war spread across oceans. Factories that had once sat idle now roared with production, and men lined up not for bread but for enlistment papers. Elijah Boone was an old man by then. His back was bent, his beard white, but his eyes still sharp as a hawk. Clara Jensen, spry even in her 60s, ran her warehouses with the same grit she always had. She saw opportunity in the chaos, though never at the expense of conscience. Wars break men, she said one evening, sitting across from Elijah on his porch, the radio humming faint news from Europe. But they also forge economies. If we're careful, if we're steady, we can help build something that lasts after the guns go quiet. Elijah nodded slowly. The trick, he murmured, is making sure we don't let greed drive the wagon. When America entered the war, their community changed overnight. Young men traded plows for rifles, and the railroads rattled with shipments of steel, grain, and boots. Clara warehouses became vital depots, stocking everything from canned goods to machine parts. She didn't gouge prices, though she could have. Instead, she worked with the government, accepting fair contracts that kept her workers employed and their families fed. Elijah, too frail for factory floors, used his mind instead. He advised banks on how to steady their lending, counseled farmers on rationing crops wisely, and wrote long letters to young businessmen leaving for war, reminding them of Amos' lessons. Patience is wealth, he wrote. Discipline is wealth. Generosity is wealth. Don't let the battlefield blind you to that. In those war years, sacrifice became the new currency. Families planted victory gardens in their yards, women worked lathes and presses, and children collected scrap metal from alleys. The whole country felt stitched together by the same thread, survival. Clara became something of a legend in town. Folks said she had a gift for turning scarcity into strength. When rubber was rationed, she found a supplier in Mexico who shipped enough for her truck fleet to keep running. When sugar vanished, she struck a deal with a farmer in Cuba. Adaptation, she'd tell her workers, ain't about being clever for a day. It's about staying steady for decades.
The war raged on, and telegrams with bad news darkened too many doorsteps. Elijah lost his grandson in France. Clara wept when she heard of young Samuel Jr., the son of that ambitious lawyer who'd once chased speculation, fallen in the Pacific. But even in sorrow, the community stood firm. Every funeral was followed by neighbors bringing bread. Every widow found work in the warehouses. Every orphan had a warm meal at the kitchen Elijah Bank sponsored. "We endure," Elijah whispered once at a memorial service, "that the only way to honor the fallen by keeping on." When the war finally ended in 1945, the town erupted in joy. Church bells rang, factories blew their whistles, and men marched home to ticker-tape parades. But beneath the celebrations, Clara and Elijah both knew this was only the beginning. The post-war world was hungry for homes, for automobiles, for refrigerators, for peace. Industries that had churned out tanks now turned to tractors. GIS, backed by government loans, wanted to start businesses, buy land, raise families. Clara seized the moment. She expanded her warehouses, filling them with everything households would need to rebuild their lives. But she didn't expand recklessly. She remembered 1929, remembered how speculation had gutted so many dreams. Instead, she built steady contracts, secured long-term suppliers, and reinvested profits into the town itself, schools, roads, hospitals. Elijah, though frail, still offered counsel. Young men gathered around his porch to hear his gravelly voice recite Amos' old campfire lessons, now seasoned by decades of trials. "Don't chase the quick buck," he'd say, coughing into his handkerchief. "Invest in what feeds, what shelters, what lasts. Don't let pride blind you to patience, and above all, remember that your wealth ain't just yours. It belongs to the community that raised you." One evening in 1948, Clara sat with Elijah as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold. His hands trembled now, his pipe cold and forgotten in his lap. "You ever think Amos knew we'd carry his words this far?" Elijah asked quietly. Clara smiled, though her eyes were damp. "He didn't have to know. He just lived them. That's all any of us can do." Elijah chuckled, though it was thin. "Well then, I reckon I've done my part." A few weeks later, Elijah Boone passed in his sleep, leaving behind not just wealth, not just land, but a legacy of patience, wisdom, and generosity. At his funeral, Clara stood tall, her voice strong though her heart ached. "He taught us that money is a tool, not a master," she said to the crowd. "That a man's fortune is measured by how many lives he lifts, not how many coins he counts." We will carry that truth, and we will honor it. The crowd bowed their heads. The campfire of Amos' wisdom still burning passed from one generation to the next. And as the 1950s began, Clara found herself at the helm of a new era. The town grew into a city, the warehouses into corporations. But she never let the old ways fade. She still sat with young entrepreneurs, telling them about Elijah, about Amos, about the importance of building wealth that outlasted storms. She'd laugh sometimes, leaning back in her chair, eyes distant. Funny things, she'd say. It all started with a cowboy sitting by a fire, telling stories. And here we are, still living by his words. The listeners, often young men and women with stars in their eyes, nodded, and they carried those words forward into a world that was changing faster than a horse could run. The 1950s rolled in like a fresh dawn, warm and bright. America was alive with promise. Soldiers had returned, families were growing, suburbs spread like wheat fields, and factories purred like well-fed cats. Folks were buying homes, cars, radios, and soon enough, televisions. Clara Jensen stood at the center of it all. Her warehouses had become the beating heart of the region, supplying everything from refrigerators to school desks. She'd built offices now, hired managers, and yet she still insisted on walking the floors herself, talking with workers by name. Never forget the faces behind the figures, she'd tell her executives. Balance sheets don't raise families, people do. The town, once humble, had blossomed into a city, and Clara was called the Iron Widow in the newspapers, not for ruthlessness, but for her strength, her unyielding presence in a world where men still thought business belonged to them. She laughed at the name but wore it proudly, knowing she carried Amos lessons like a torch. The post-war boom wasn't just about stealing wages, it was about dreams. The government poured money into highways, making cars a necessity. GI loans turned young couples into homeowners. Television brought the world into living rooms, shining with polished smiles and jingles that made consumerism a new religion. Elijah's grandson, Thomas Boone, stepped into that world with both eagerness and caution. He'd grown up hearing Amos' words secondhand, carried through Elijah porch talks and Clara mentorship. Now, as a man in his 30s, he sought his fortune in construction. Folks don't just want roofs, he told Clara one evening over coffee in her office. They want homes. Homes with fences, gardens, and enough room for their kids to run. Clara leaned back, eyes twinkling, and give it to him, Thomas, but build 'em to last. Don't cut corners for a quick buck. A man home is his anchor. Treat it like gold. Thomas did just that. With borrowed money, carefully borrowed, under Clara guidance, he built neighborhoods. Rows of modest, sturdy houses sprang up, each one sold before the paint dried. Families poured in, paying mortgages with steady factory wages, and the city grew outward in neat suburban circles. But Thomas remembered his grandfather's warnings: patience, discipline, generosity. He set aside part of his profits to fund parks, libraries, and community halls. Parents trusted him, neighbors respected him, and his reputation spread far beyond the county line. It wasn't long before bankers and politicians came knocking. Expand faster, they urged, their demand. Double your loans, triple your growth. But Thomas shook his head. I'll grow steady, he said, not reckless. That patience kept him safe when interest rates jumped in the late 50s, sinking overeager developers who had borrowed too deep. Thomas weathered the storm, his neighborhood still standing proud, his debts paid on time. Folks whispered that the Boone name carried luck, but Thomas knew better. It wasn't luck, it was legacy. Meanwhile, Clara, now in her 70s, found herself less on warehouse floors and more at university halls. Colleges invited her to speak, curious how a woman of her generation had built an empire. She stood before young faces, gray hair tied back, her voice steady. You think success is about being clever, she told them, but it ain't. It's about being steady when others panic, generous when others hoard, disciplined when others gamble. Business ain't a sprint, it's a trail ride across a desert. You pace your horse, or you'll never make the other side. Her words lit fires in those students. Some chased Wall Street, others started small shops, but many carried her voice in their heads long after graduation. The 1960s brought change faster than anyone could saddle. Music filled the airwaves, civil rights movements shook the streets, and young people questioned everything their parents had built. Thomas watched his workers' sons march with protest signs, his daughters speak of equality and opportunity. At first, he worried. Will they tear down what we've built? He asked Clara, now frail but sharp as ever. She smiled, slow and thoughtful. Every generation asks that, Thomas. Don't fear their questions. Fear only the silence that comes when no one willing to ask them. He nodded, realizing that wealth wasn't just about money or houses.
It was about building a society worth living in. So he funded scholarships for local youth, regardless of color or creed. He opened his construction business to hire those often left out. And though it ruffled feathers, he stood firm. Fortune, he told his children one night by the fire, ain't measured by what you hoard, it measured by the bridges you build. In those years, the campfire stories of Amos Boone still lingered like smoke on the wind. Thomas told them to his own children, who listened wide-eyed as he spoke of a cowboy who'd once sat under stars, warning of greed and teaching patience. And though the world now roared with television and highways, those lessons still felt as true as the steady beat of a horse's hooves. The city, once a dusty town, now sparkled with neon signs, glass towers, and busy streets. Yet in its heart, the Boone name and Clara legacy lived on, proof that steady hands and generous spirits could shape not just fortunes, but futures. The 1970s dawned not with promise, but with shadows. The world was restless. War overseas drained wallets and spirits, and the oil embargo sent fuel prices climbing higher than a hawk on a summer updraft. Gas lines stretched for blocks, tempers flared, and for the first time in decades, Americans questioned whether tomorrow would really be brighter than today. Thomas Boone, now a seasoned man with gray streak in his hair, felt the storm settling in. His construction project slowed as interest rates climbed sky high. Families who once dreamed of neat houses and fenced yards now counted pennies just to keep their cars fueled and lights burning. Hard times don't announce themselves, Thomas told his eldest son Robert one winter night. The two sat by the hearth, the firelight flickering over tired faces. They sneak in, quiet as coyotes, until one day you realize they've taken a seat at your table. The trick ain't to panic, the trick to keep your seat too. Unlike many developers who had borrowed big on promises of endless growth, Thomas kept his debts lean. He slowed projects, focused on refinements, and leaned into repair work instead of expansion. Where others folded, he bent without breaking. But the era wasn't just about money, it was about trust. Folks, weary of inflation and government stumbling, grew cynical. Families fretted over jobs, young people bristled against old institutions, and the steady drum of change seemed to drown out every certainty. Robert, a young man in his 30s, stood at the crossroads. He admired his father's discipline but hungered for new paths. One evening he told Thomas, "Pop, the world ain't bricks and beams anymore, it numbers and wires. Finance, computers, new markets, that's where fortunes are being made." Thomas frowned, but not out of anger. "Maybe so, son, but don't forget what makes a fortune worth holding. Land, houses, communities, they don't vanish when the wind changes. Numbers on a screen, they can disappear before your morning coffee cools." Robert listened but felt the pull of the times. He studied finance, worked late nights in city offices, and by the early 80s had carved a place on Wall Street. While Thomas kept to the steady beat of construction, Robert danced in the whirlwind of bonds, mergers, and leveraged buyouts. At first, the Boone family worried. Robert's work seemed as far from Amos' campfire wisdom as the moon from the prairie. Yet Robert himself carried a cautious hand, hearing echoes of his grandfather's words even in the clang of trading floors. Patience, discipline, generosity, Amos had said long ago. Robert etched those words onto the back of his office notebook, a secret compass in a world where greed ran hotter than oil fires. The 1980s brought Reaganomics, deregulation, and a flood of credit. Some grew rich overnight, others sank just as fast. Junk bonds made headlines, fortunes bloomed and burst like summer storms. Clara Jensen had long since passed, but her legacy whispered still. Robert, unlike many of his peers, resisted the urge to gamble every dollar on risky schemes. Instead, he looked for undervalued companies, steady businesses ignored by the frenzied crowd. "Buy what lasts," he muttered, a lesson borrowed from Clara and Amos both. Meanwhile, Thomas, though older and slower, kept building homes and schools. He chuckled when he read about his son Wall Street exploits. "You can dress up money in fancy suits," he'd say, "but it still boils down to trust and time." The Boone family faced their toughest trial yet when a recession in the early 80s shuttered factories and bled jobs. Families abandoned homes, towns struggled, and once busy streets fell quiet. Thomas refused to lay off his crews entirely, even when profits thinned to paper. "These men built with me," he told Robert, "and I won't cast them aside when the wind turns cold." He took on repair contracts for the city, even when they barely broke even, just to keep his workers employed. Robert, watching from Wall Street, felt a tug in his chest. Numbers and deals filled his days, but back home his father's stubborn loyalty reminded him that fortunes weren't measured only in dollars. One summer he returned, standing among rough hands and worn boots,
watching his father joke with bricklayers despite his aching back. It was then Robert realized wealth was never meant to be silent. It was meant to echo through jobs, through communities, through lives made better. The Boone legacy didn't fracture between construction and finance, it evolved. Robert brought his Wall Street know-how to stabilize his father's business, securing low-interest loans at just the right times, diversifying investments so downturns didn't cripple the company. Thomas, in turn, grounded Robert, reminding him that no spreadsheet could match the weight of a family holding a house key for the first time. Together they bridged eras, Thomas with bricks, Robert with bonds, both guided by Amos cowboy wisdom, still flickering like a campfire through the decades. By the close of the 80s, neon lights glowed over cities, computers hummed in offices, and fortunes rose on silicon as much as steel. Yet the Boones remained steady, never the richest, never the flashiest, but always enduring. And in quiet moments, Robert found himself thinking of a man he'd never met, sitting under stars in a desert long ago, speaking of patience, discipline, and generosity. Amos Boone might have been dust in memory, but his lessons still rode strong, carrying his kin through storms no cowboy could have imagined. The 1990s rolled in with the crackle of possibility. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Cold War was ending, and the world felt like it was open and wider than ever before. New markets, new alliances, and a strange new frontier called the Internet promised riches faster than oil gushing from a Texas well. Robert Boone, now a middle-aged man with salt flecking his dark hair, found himself watching this new frontier with equal parts excitement and caution. He'd survived the chaos of the 80s by keeping steady, but this was something altogether different. His son Daniel, just out of college, saw none of the dangers. "Dad," he said one Thanksgiving, laptop open on the kitchen table, "this thing gonna change everything. Shopping, banking, even how people talk to each other. We can invest in companies that don't even need buildings, just websites." Robert frowned. "Son, wealth built on nothing but promises is like a barn raised without nails. First strong wind, and it gone." But Daniel's eyes sparkled with conviction. "Maybe, but what if this is the wind itself? What if we're the ones riding it, not bracing against it?" By the mid-90s, the Boones were standing at a crossroads again, much like when Robert had split from his father Thomas' bricks and mortar ways. Daniel dove into venture capital, investing in tech startups alongside other young dreamers who spoke in acronyms and carried more confidence than caution. Websites sprouted faster than weeds, each claiming to be the future. Robert shook his head but gave his son leeway, remembering how Thomas had once trusted him to carve his own path. "Just keep Amos rules in your pocket," Robert said one evening. "Patience, discipline, generosity. Don't let the shine blind you." Daniel nodded, but the truth was, patience seemed outdated in the dot-com world. Overnight millionaires filled newspapers, stock tickers flashed numbers climbing skyward, and even seasoned investors forgot the lessons carved by decades of storms. By 1999, Daniel had struck gold, or what looked like gold. He backed a small e-commerce company that rocketed to $1 billion valuation within months. His name was whispered in rooms filled with venture capital giants, and for a brief, dizzying stretch, it seemed the Boones might become legends not just in their hometown, but in financial circles across the globe. Robert visited his son Manhattan office one spring. Glass walls, buzzing phones, screens glowing with green arrows pointing upward. He stood quiet, watching the chaos before finally saying, "It mighty loud for a room that don't seem to own much more than air." Daniel laughed nervously, but in his heart he knew his father wasn't wrong. The crash came in 2000, swift and merciless. Overnight, billions in paper wealth vanished like morning mist. Daniel's prized investment crumbled. Its website shuttered, servers unplugged. He watched his fortune collapse faster than it had risen, the silence afterward louder than the cheers had ever been. For weeks, Daniel barely spoke. He returned home, sitting on the porch of his father's house, staring out across the quiet fields. Robert sat beside him, neither saying much at first. Finally, Robert placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Son," he said softly, "you flew high, higher than most ever dreamed, and you fell. But falling ain't the end, it's just the ground reminding you to plant your feet again." Daniel swallowed hard. "I thought I was being bold. I thought I was building something that lasts." "You were bold," Robert said, "but boldness without roots is just drifting. Amos taught me that, Thomas showed me that, and now you've learned it the hard way." Unlike many who went bankrupt, Daniel hadn't over-leveraged. He'd lost millions, but not everything. Robert's steady hand, the bonds, the diversified investments, the land back home, had shielded the family from total ruin. So Daniel began again, this time slower, this time wiser. He didn't abandon technology, but he searched for companies that offered more than hype. Firms building infrastructure, providing real value, connecting people in ways that lasted. The lessons of Amos and Clara and Thomas echoed louder than ever. The early 2000s brought more storms. The tragedy of 9/11 shook the nation, and markets reeled. The Boones, like everyone, felt the grief heavy in their chests, but even in sorrow they stood together. As globalization stretched its reach, Robert, now approaching retirement, watched with mixed feelings. Jobs flowed overseas, factories closed, but opportunities opened in new corners of the world. Daniel, older and steadier, built partnerships with firms in Europe and Asia, careful to keep each move tethered to real value. In 2008, the world trembled again when reckless lending and speculation brought the financial system to its knees. Banks fell, markets crashed, and panic spread. Robert, by then an old man, shook his head at the sight. Every generation thinks their storm is unique, he told Daniel, but greed and fear are the same beasts they've always been. It's how you handle them that makes the difference. The Boone family weathered the crisis, not untouched, but unbroken. They leaned on land, on steady businesses, on community. Daniel remembered his father's words, his grandfather's sacrifices, and his great-grandfather campfire wisdom. And so the Boone name carried on into the 21st century, not the richest, not the flashiest, but resilient. They proved again and again that true fortune isn't found in sudden riches, but in lessons passed down, in discipline held firm, and in generosity shared when others stumble.
Hey partner, I hope you're already asleep, but if not, let me ask you a question. Where are you watching this from? I hope you fall into deep sleep with this next story. The Gold of Patience. A cowboy tale of wealth and wisdom. Here the fire hadn't burned down yet. Its glow danced across Colton Hayes' weathered face, each line carved deep like the canyons he'd ridden through in his youth. His voice came again, slow and steady, like the drawl of a river cutting through stone. Now, I told y'all how patience and steady saving gave me my first start, he said, drawing a coal back into the flame with the toe of his boot. But a man's fortune don't come from one lesson alone. Nah, it's the road itself that teaches him every misstep, every storm, every fool decision, and every blessing. And I reckon I got more than a few of each to share. The rain had eased to a light sprinkle, soft enough now that the fire hissed only every so often. His listeners leaned in closer, the warmth of the blaze and the rhythm of his words weaving a kind of lullaby. Colton took a long breath. Once I had that first patch of land and a handful of cattle, I figured I'd made it. I strutted into town like I owned the whole territory. But pride, well, it a trickster. Pride will whisper in your ear telling you you're bigger than the boots you wear. Now listen. Lord knows I listened too well. He remembered the day clear as daylight. A banker, slick-haired and sharp-tongued, came riding through with talk of expansion. Promised Colton that with a loan and a little risk, he could double his herd in a season, maybe triple. Said land was cheap and beef was selling high in the northern cities. I signed the paper, Colton muttered, voice dropping low, and for a while, I thought I'd outsmarted the world. Bought more land, more cattle, more everything. I was living like a king. Boys, new boots, fine coats, and a table that never ran out of food. The fire snapped and Colton stared into it for a moment before speaking again. But markets, they don't ride steady. Beef prices dropped faster than a bronco throwing a green rider. Cattle got sick and half the herd died before I could sell them. That loan I took on, it weighed heavier than a mountain. I came close to losing everything, the land, the herd, the roof over my head. That was the winter I slept with an empty belly more nights than I care to remember. He shifted, spitting into the dirt before looking back at his listeners. It was then I learned another truth. Debt'll tie a man down faster than a hangman noose. Banks don't care about your troubles and pride won't feed you. That winter taught me to fear loans more than I ever feared outlaws. So I swore no matter how tempting the offer, I'd build slow and steady, never again selling tomorrow just to feel rich today. The cowboys around the fire nodded. Some had lived at two bad loans, broken promises, wealth that turned to dust overnight. Colton's eyes softened, his voice taking on a more peaceful tone. But here's the beauty of it. Surviving that storm made me tougher, smarter. I went back to the basics, saving, mending fences, growing my herd one calf at a time. Folks laughed at me, said I was small time, said I'd never recover. But I didn't care. I wasn't building for applause, I was building for sleep. The kind of sleep that comes when you ain't worrying if some banker gonna take your land come sunrise. The rain tapped steady now, the rhythm soft as a lullaby against the cabin roof. I reckon wealth is like planting mesquite, Colton continued. It don't shoot up fast like weeds. Nah, it grows slow, digging deep roots first. Roots so strong that when the dry years come, it still stands tall.
That the kind of wealth worth having? Takes longer, but it lasts. He leaned back, the firelight catching his silver beard, and over time I saw something strange. The more I lived simple, patching my coat instead of buying a new one, cooking beans instead of fancy meals, the fuller my life got. Because I wasn't chasing the next shiny thing. I was chasing peace. And peace, well, it's richer than gold. Colton let out a soft chuckle. Now, don't think I turned into some miser, sitting on coins like a rattler guarding its den. No, sir. I learned the power of giving. You see, when a man got more than he needs and he opens his hand instead of closing his fist, something mighty fine happens. The world gives back. Maybe not right away, maybe not in the way you expect, but it comes back, sure as the rain. He recalled the day he helped a drifter thin as a rail, shoes worn clear through. Gave him a meal, a bed in the barn, even slipped him a few dollars for the trail. Most men would have called it foolish. But years later, that same drifter showed up again. Older, steadier, owning a small store in town. He gave Colton supplies on credit during a hard drought, refusing payment till Colton was back on his feet. That wealth too, Colton said softly, the kind you can't measure in dollars. Wealth built on trust, on kindness, on the good you send out into the world. Money buys comfort, sure, but generosity buys loyalty, respect, and friendships that don't fade when the gold does. The fire was burning low now, but no one stirred. The rain rhythm mixed with the deep, steady drawl of the old cowboy voice. So if you take one thing from this old fool rambling, Colton whispered, his eyes half closed, let it be this. Grow your wealth like roots. Slow, steady, deep. Don't chase it wild like a colt across the plains. And when you got more than enough, let it flow. Share it, help others, and watch how the river of money circles back to you, cleaner and stronger. He shifted in his saddle blanket, pulled his hat low over his brow, and gave the last of his wisdom like a benediction. That's the real gold, boys. Not coins, not cattle. It's peace, it's trust, it's sleep and sound under a roof that's yours, with a fire that don't go out and a belly that fed. Build that and you'll be rich long after the bankers, the prospectors, and the dreamers are gone. The fire crackled, the rain whispered, and one by one the listeners drifted into sleep, their dreams filled not with shiny treasure, but with wide open fields, steady work, and the quiet wealth of a life well lived. The fire had dimmed to a bed of glowing coals, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The rain, gentle as a mother hush, pattered on the roof above, and the cowboys sat wrapped in blankets, their eyes heavy but fixed on Colton Hayes. His voice, weathered and worn, filled the night air like a hymn. No, he began, drawing in a breath slow as smoke. A man don't truly understand wealth till he's seen both sides of it. Plenty and nothing. I learned early that riches aren't just what jingle in your pocket. No, sir. Riches are how you handle yourself when you ain't got 2 dimes to rub together. And how you treat others when you've got a pocket full. He poked at the embers with a stick, the sparks floating skyward like fireflies. After that hard winter with the loans and the sickness, I got humbled. Proper humble. But I reckon it was the best gift I ever got. Humbled men don't waste money on flash, and they sure don't gamble it away on promises. Instead, they count every penny like it a prayer, and they learn to make each one do the work of 10. That when I came up with my 3 rules of keeping money, they ain't failed me since. The cowboys leaned in closer, and Colton raised one finger, his voice a whisper just above the crackle of fire. First rule, never spend a dollar quicker than you earn it. If the good Lord gave you a day work and a day pay, that pay ought to last you longer than just that day. Tuck some away, even if it's just a nickel. Put it aside, like seeds in the ground. The little coins will grow if you let them. He lifted a second finger. Second rule, don't tie your neck with debt. A man who owes is a man who don't sleep. You think cattle rustlers are scary? Try sleeping knowing the bank waiting at your door. That fear eats at you worse than wolves. Freedom ain't riding the fastest horse or wearing the finest hat. It's knowing nobody got a claim on your land, your stock, or your soul. Finally, he raised a third finger, hand steady despite his age. Third rule, let your money work for you, but don't let it boss you around. Some fellas chase after profit like a hound on a scent, losing themselves in the run. But the trick is letting your savings do their job, buying land, stock, or tools that'll earn you more over time while you stay calm, steady, and in control. You own the money. Don't let the money own you. The words drifted out into the night, slow and steady, each one settling into the minds of the men listening. Colton leaned back, eyes catching the glow of the embers. It took me near 20 years to understand those rules proper. In that time, I lost friends to greed, saw neighbors spend themselves out of their farms, and watched families break apart over arguments about inheritance. But the men who lived steady, who kept their pride in check and their savings tucked safe up in they sat under a roof that's yours, with a fire that don't go out and a belly that fed. Build that and you'll be rich long after the bankers, the prospectors, and the dreamers are gone. The fire crackled, the rain whispered, and one by one the listeners drifted into sleep, their dreams filled not with shiny treasure, but with wide open fields, steady work, and the quiet wealth of a life well lived. The fire had dimmed to a bed of glowing coals, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The rain, gentle as a mother hush, pattered on the roof above, and the cowboys sat wrapped in blankets, their eyes heavy but fixed on Colton Hayes. His voice, weathered and worn, filled the night air like a hymn. "No," he began, drawing in a breath slow as smoke. "A man don't truly understand wealth till he's seen both sides of it, plenty and nothing. I learned early that riches aren't just what jingle in your pocket. No, sir. Riches are how you handle yourself when you ain't got 2 dimes to rub together, how you treat others when you've got a pocket full." He poked at the embers with a stick, the sparks floating skyward like fireflies. "After that hard winter with the loans and the sickness, I got humbled, proper humbled. But I reckon it was the best gift I ever got. Humbled men don't waste money on flash, and they sure don't gamble it away on promises. Instead, they count every penny like it a prayer, and they learn to make each one do the work of 10. That when I came up with my 3 rules of keeping money, and they ain't failed me since." The cowboys leaned in closer, and Colton raised one finger, his voice a whisper just above the crackle of fire. "First rule, never spend $1 quicker than you earn. If the good Lord gave you a day work and a day pay, that pay ought to last you longer than just that day. Tuck some away, even if it's just a nickel. Put it aside, like seeds in the ground. Them little coins will grow if you let them." He lifted a second finger. "Second rule, don't tie your neck with debt. A man who owes is a man who don't sleep. You think cattle rustlers are scary? Try sleeping knowing the bank waiting at your door. That fear eats at you worse than wolves. Freedom ain't riding the fastest horse or wearing the finest hat, knowing nobody got a claim on your land, your stock, or your soul." Finally, he raised a third finger, hand steady despite his age. "Third rule, let your money work for you, but don't let it boss you around. Some fellas chase after profit like a hound on a scent, losing themselves in the run. But the trick is letting your savings do their job, buying land, stock, or tools that'll earn you more over time while you stay calm, steady, and in control. You own the money. Don't let the money own you." The words drifted out into the night, slow and steady, each one settling into the minds of the man listening. Colton leaned back, eyes catching the glow of the embers. "It took me near 20 years to understand those rules proper. In that time, I lost friends to greed, saw neighbors spend themselves out of their farms, and watched families break apart over arguments about inheritance. But the men who lived steady, who kept their pride in check and their savings tucked safe up in they sat under a roof that's yours, with a fire that don't go out and a belly that fed. Build that and you'll be rich long after the bankers, the prospectors, and the dreamers are gone." The fire crackled, the rain whispered, and one by one the listeners drifted into sleep, their dreams filled not with shiny treasure, but with wide open fields, steady work, and the quiet wealth of a life well lived. The fire had dimmed to a bed of glowing coals, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The rain, gentle as a mother hush, pattered on the roof above, and the cowboys sat wrapped in blankets, their eyes heavy but fixed on Colton Hayes. His voice, weathered and worn, filled the night air like a hymn. "No," he began, drawing in a breath slow as smoke. "A man don't truly understand wealth till he's seen both sides of it. Plenty and nothing. I learned early that riches aren't just what jingle in your pocket. No, sir. Riches are how you handle yourself when you ain't got 2 dimes to rub together, and how you treat others when you've got a pocket full." He poked at the embers with a stick, the sparks floating skyward like fireflies. "After that hard winter with the loans and the sickness, I got humbled, proper humbled. But I reckon it was the best gift I ever got. Humbled men don't waste money on flash, and they sure don't gamble it away on promises. Instead, they count every penny like it a prayer, and they learn to make each one do the work of 10. That when I came up with my 3 rules of keeping money, they ain't failed me since." The cowboys leaned in closer, and Colton raised one finger, his voice a whisper just above the crackle of fire. "First rule, never spend $1 quicker than you earn it. If the good Lord gave you a day work and a day pay, that pay ought to last you longer than just that day. Tuck some away, even if it's just a nickel. Put it aside, like seeds in the ground. Them little coins will grow if you let them." He lifted a second finger. "Second rule, don't tie your neck with debt. A man who owes is a man who don't sleep. You think cattle rustlers are scary? Try sleeping knowing the bank waiting at your door. That fear eats at you worse than wolves. Freedom ain't riding the fastest horse or wearing the finest hat, knowing nobody got a claim on your land, your stock, or your soul." Finally, he raised a third finger, hand steady despite his age. "Third rule, let your money work for you, but don't let it boss you around. Some fellas chase after profit like a hound on a scent, losing themselves in the run. But the trick is letting your savings do their job, buying land, stock, or tools that'll earn you more over time while you stay calm, steady, and in control. You own the money. Don't let the money own you." The words drifted out into the night, slow and steady, each one settling into the minds of the man listening. Colton leaned back, eyes catching the glow of the embers. "It Took me near 20 years to understand those rules proper. In that time, I lost friends to greed, saw neighbors spend themselves out of their farms, and watched families break apart over arguments about inheritance. But the men who lived steady, who kept their pride in check and their savings tucked safe, have been made to set under a roof that's yours. With a fire that don't go out and a belly that fed. Build that and you'll be rich long after the bankers, the prospectors, and the dreamers are gone. The fire crackled, the rain whispered, and one by one the listeners drifted into sleep, their dreams filled not with shiny treasure, but with wide open fields, steady work, and the quiet wealth of a life well lived. The fire had dimmed to a bed of glowing coals, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The rain, gentle as a mother hush, pattered on the roof above, and the cowboys sat wrapped in blankets, their eyes heavy but fixed on Colton Hayes. His voice, weathered and warm, filled the night air like a hymn. No, he began, drawing in a breath slow as smoke. A man don't truly understand wealth till he's seen both sides of it. Plenty and nothing. I learned early that riches aren't just what jingle in your pocket. No, sir. Riches are how you handle yourself when you ain't got 2 dimes to rub together. And how you treat others when you've got a pocket full. He poked at the embers with a stick, the sparks floating skyward like fireflies. After that hard winter with the loans and the sickness, I got humbled. Proper humble. But I reckon it was the best gift I ever got. Humbled men don't waste money on flash, and they sure don't gamble it away on promises. Instead, they count every penny like it a prayer, and they learn to make each one do the work of 10. That when I came up with my 3 rules of keeping money, they ain't failed me since. The cowboys leaned in closer, and Colton raised one finger, his voice a whisper just above the crackle of fire. First rule, never spend $1 quicker than you earn it. If the good Lord gave you a day work and a day pay, that pay ought to last you longer than just that day. Tuck some away, even if it's just a nickel. Put it aside, like seeds in the ground, and little coins will grow if you let them. He lifted a second finger. Second rule, don't tie your neck with debt. A man who owes is a man who don't sleep. You think cattle rustlers are scary? Try sleeping knowing the bank waiting at your door. That fear eats at you worse than wolves. Freedom ain't riding the fastest horse or wearing the finest hat, knowing nobody got a claim on your land, your stock, or your soul. Finally, he raised a third finger, hand steady despite his age. Third rule, let your money work for you, but don't let it boss you around. Some fellas chase after profit like a hound on a scent, losing themselves in the run. But the trick is letting your savings do their job, buying land, stock, or tools that'll earn you more over time while you stay calm, steady, and in control. You own the money. Don't let the money own you. The words drifted out into the night, slow and steady, each one settling into the minds of the man listening. Colton leaned back, eyes catching the glow of the embers. Took me near 20 years to understand those rules proper. In that time, I lost friends to greed, saw neighbors spend themselves out of their farms, and watched families break apart over arguments about inheritance. But the men who lived steady, who kept their pride in check and their savings tucked safe, have been made to set under a roof that's yours. With a fire that don't go out and a belly that fed. Build that and you'll be rich long after the bankers, the prospectors, and the dreamers are gone. The fire crackled, the rain whispered, and one by one the listeners drifted into sleep, their dreams filled not with shiny treasure, but with wide open fields, steady work, and the quiet wealth of a life well lived. The fire had dimmed to a bed of glowing coals, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The rain, gentle as a mother hush, pattered on the roof above, and the cowboys sat wrapped in blankets, their eyes heavy but fixed on Colton Hayes. His voice, weathered and warm, filled the night air like a hymn. No, he began, drawing in a breath slow as smoke. A man don't truly understand wealth till he's seen both sides of it. Plenty and nothing. I learned early that riches aren't just what jingle in your pocket. No, sir. Riches are how you handle yourself when you ain't got 2 dimes to rub together. And how you treat others when you've got a pocket full. He poked at the embers with a stick, the sparks floating skyward like fireflies. After that hard winter with the loans and the sickness, I got humbled. Proper humble. But I reckon it was the best gift I ever got. Humbled men don't waste money on flash, and they sure don't gamble it away on promises. Instead, they count every penny like it a prayer, and they learn to make each one do the work of 10. That when I came up with my 3 rules of keeping money, they ain't failed me since. The cowboys leaned in closer, and Colton raised one finger, his voice a whisper just above the crackle of fire. First rule, never spend $1 quicker than you earn it. If the good Lord gave you a day work and a day pay, that pay ought to last you longer than just that day. Tuck some away, even if it's just a nickel. Put it aside, like seeds in the ground, and little coins will grow if you let them. He lifted a second finger. Second rule, don't tie your neck with debt. A man who owes is a man who don't sleep. You think cattle rustlers are scary? Try sleeping knowing the bank waiting at your door. That fear eats at you worse than wolves. Freedom ain't riding the fastest horse or wearing the finest hat, knowing nobody got a claim on your land, your stock, or your soul. Finally, he raised a third finger, hand steady despite his age. Third rule, let your money work for you, but don't let it boss you around. Some fellas chase after profit like a hound on a scent, losing themselves in the run. But the trick is letting your savings do their job, buying land, stock, or tools that'll earn you more over time while you stay calm, steady, and in control. You own the money. Don't let the money own you. The words drifted out into the night, slow and steady, each one settling into the minds of the man listening. Colton leaned back, eyes catching the glow of the embers. It took me near 20 years to understand those rules proper. In that time, I lost friends to greed, saw neighbors spend themselves out of their farms, and watched families break apart over arguments about inheritance. But the men who lived steady, who kept their pride in check and their savings tucked safe up in the sat under a roof that's yours, with a fire that don't go out and a belly that fed. Build that and you'll be rich long after the bankers, the prospectors, and the dreamers are gone. The fire crackled, the rain whispered, and one by one the listeners drifted into sleep, their dreams filled not with shiny treasure, but with wide open fields, steady work, and the quiet wealth of a life well lived. The fire had dimmed to a bed of glowing coals, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The rain, gentle as a mother hush, pattered on the roof above, and the cowboys sat wrapped in blankets, their eyes heavy but fixed on Colton Hayes. His voice, weathered and worn, filled the night air like a hymn. No, he began, drawing in a breath slow as smoke. A man don't truly understand wealth till he's seen both sides of it, plenty and nothing. I learned early that riches aren't just what jingle in your pocket. No, sir. Riches are how you handle yourself when you ain't got two dimes to rub together, how you treat others when you've got a pocket full. He poked at the embers with a stick, the sparks floating skyward like fireflies. After that hard winter with the loans and the sickness, I got humbled, proper humbled. But I reckon it was the best gift I ever got. Humbled men don't waste money on flash, and they sure don't gamble it away on promises. Instead, they count every penny like it a prayer, and they learn to make each one do the work of 10. That when I came up with my 3 rules of keeping money, they ain't failed me since. The cowboys leaned in closer, and Colton raised one finger, his voice a whisper just above the crackle of fire. First rule, never spend a dollar quicker than you earn it. If the good Lord gave you a day work and a day pay, that pay ought to last you longer than just that day. Tuck some away, even if it's just a nickel. Put it aside, like seeds in the ground. The little coins will grow if you let them. He lifted a second finger. Second rule, don't tie your neck with debt. A man who owes is a man who don't sleep. You think cattle rustlers are scary? Try sleeping knowing the bank waiting at your door. That fear eats at you worse than wolves. Freedom ain't riding the fastest horse or wearing the finest hat, knowing nobody got a claim on your land, your stock, or your soul. Finally, he raised a third finger, hand steady despite his age. Third rule, let your money work for you, but don't let it boss you around. Some fellas chase after profit like a hound on a scent, losing themselves in the run. But the trick is letting your savings do their job, buying land, stock, or tools that'll earn you more over time while you stay calm, steady, and in control. You own the money. Don't let the money own you. The words drifted out into the night, slow and steady, each one settling into the minds of the man listening. Colton leaned back, eyes catching the glow of the embers. It took me near 20 years to understand those rules proper. In that time, I lost friends to greed, saw neighbors spend themselves out of their farms, and watched families break apart over arguments about inheritance. But the men who lived steady, who kept their pride in check and their savings tucked safe up in the sat under a roof that's yours, with a fire that don't go out and a belly that fed. Build that and you'll be rich long after the bankers, the prospectors, and the dreamers are gone. The fire crackled, the rain whispered, and one by one the listeners drifted into sleep, their dreams filled not with shiny treasure, but with wide open fields, steady work, and the quiet wealth of a life well lived. The fire had dimmed to a bed of glowing coals, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The rain, gentle as a mother hush, pattered on the roof above, and the cowboys sat wrapped in blankets, their eyes heavy but fixed on Colton Hayes. His voice, weathered and worn, filled the night air like a hymn. No, he began, drawing in a breath slow as smoke. A man don't truly understand wealth till he's seen both sides of it, plenty and nothing. I learned early that riches aren't just what jingle in your pocket. No, sir. Riches are how you handle yourself when you ain't got 2 dimes to rub together, how you treat others when you've got a pocket full. He poked at the embers with a stick, the sparks floating skyward like fireflies. After that hard winter with the loans and the sickness, I got humbled, proper humbled. But I reckon it was the best gift I ever got. Humbled men don't waste money on flash, and they sure don't gamble it away on promises. Instead, they count every penny like it a prayer, and they learn to make each one do the work of 10. That when I came up with my 3 rules of keeping money, they ain't failed me since. The cowboys leaned in closer, and Colton raised one finger, his voice a whisper just above the crackle of fire. First rule, never spend a dollar quicker than you earn it. If the good Lord gave you a day work and a day pay, that pay ought to last you longer than just that day. Tuck some away, even if it's just a nickel. Put it aside, like seeds in the ground. The little coins will grow if you let them. He lifted a second finger. Second rule, don't tie your neck with debt. A man who owes is a man who don't sleep. You think cattle rustlers are scary? Try sleeping knowing the bank waiting at your door. That fear eats at you worse than wolves. Freedom ain't riding the fastest horse or wearing the finest hat, knowing nobody got a claim on your land, your stock, or your soul. Finally, he raised a third finger, hand steady despite his age. Third rule, let your money work for you, but don't let it boss you around. Some fellas chase after profit like a hound on a scent, losing themselves in the run. But the trick is letting your savings do their job, buying land, stock, or tools that'll earn you more over time while you stay calm, steady, and in control. You own the money. Don't let the money own you. The words drifted out into the night, slow and steady, each one settling into the minds of the men listening. Colton leaned back, eyes catching the glow of the embers. Took me near 20 years to understand those rules proper. In that time, I lost friends to greed, saw neighbors spend themselves out of their farms, and watched families break apart over arguments about inheritance. But the men who lived steady, who kept their pride in check and their savings tucked safe up under a roof that's yours, with a fire that don't go out and a belly that fed. Build that and you'll be rich long after the bankers, the prospectors, and the dreamers are gone. The fire crackled, the rain whispered, and one by one the listeners drifted into sleep, their dreams filled not with shiny treasure, but with wide open fields, steady work, and the quiet wealth of a life well lived. The fire had dimmed to a bed of glowing coals, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The rain, gentle as a mother hush, pattered on the roof above, and the cowboys sat wrapped in blankets, their eyes heavy but fixed on Colton Hayes. His voice, weathered and warm, filled the night air like a hymn. No, he began, drawing in a breath slow as smoke. A man don't truly understand wealth till he's seen both sides of it, plenty and nothing. I learned early that riches aren't just what jingle in your pocket. No, sir. Riches are how you handle yourself when you ain't got two dimes to rub together, how you treat others when you've got a pocket full. He poked at the embers with a stick, the sparks floating skyward like fireflies. After that hard winter with the loans and the sickness, I got humbled, proper humbled. But I reckon it was the best gift I ever got. Humbled men don't waste money on flash, and they sure don't gamble it away on promises. Instead, they count every penny like it a prayer, and they learn to make each one do the work of 10. That when I came up with my 3 rules of keeping money, they ain't failed me since. The cowboys leaned in closer, and Colton raised one finger, his voice a whisper just above the crackle of fire. First rule, never spend $1 quicker than you earn it. If the good Lord gave you a day work and a day pay, that pay ought to last you longer than just that day. Tuck some away, even if it's just a nickel. Put it aside, like seeds in the ground, and little coins will grow if you let them. He lifted a second finger. Second rule, don't tie your neck with debt. A man who owes is a man who don't sleep. You think cattle rustlers are scary? Try sleeping knowing the bank waiting at your door. That fear eats at you worse than wolves. Freedom ain't riding the fastest horse or wearing the finest hat, knowing nobody got a claim on your land, your stock, or your soul. Finally, he raised a third finger, hand steady despite his age. Third rule, let your money work for you, but don't let it boss you around. Some fellas chase after profit like a hound on a scent, losing themselves in the run.
But the fire smoldered lower as the night crept on, and the storm outside softened into a steady rhythm, like a lullaby, meant only for weary souls. Colton shifted in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight, and drew in a long breath. His voice, low and slow, blended with the crackle of the fire, weaving another thread into the quiet tapestry of the night. I'll tell y'all something else I learned, he began, his eyes half closed, but his words sharp as ever. It ain't just the money you earn that makes you rich. It's the habits you grow. Habits are like rivers. They start out small, just trickles in the dirt. But if you keep walking that same path, letting the water run, it carves deeper and deeper until one day you got yourself a canyon. Same with a man's choices. The little ones don't look like much at first. Skipping a meal out, putting a coin in a jar, choosing work over cards. But keep at it, and before long, you got a river of wealth flowing steady. Break those habits, though, and the river dries up, leaving nothing but dust. He looked into the fire, the glow reflecting in his tired eyes. I seen plenty of cowhands who thought saving was foolish, 'cause life's short, they said. Spend it while you got it. And I reckon they lived high for a spell. But when sickness came or the boss stopped hiring, they had nothing but memories and empty pockets. Meanwhile, the quiet fellas, the ones who patched their boots instead of buying new, who worked a side job hauling wood, who saved every extra dollar,
They're the ones who owned land in the end. Funny thing is, they ended up living longer, fuller lives too. Not flashy, but steady. And steady will carry you further than wild ever could. The rain tapped the roof in gentle rhythm, like the world itself was nodding in agreement. Colton's voice grew softer, as if he was speaking directly into the dreams of those already sleeping. They're a peace that comes from knowing you ain't one bad week away from losing everything. I remember once riding with a partner named Silas. Good man, hard worker, but he lived from wage to wage, never put a dime away. We hit a rough patch, cattle prices dropped, and the ranch cut his hours. He was broke within a fortnight, begging and borrowing, losing his pride. Not because he wasn't strong or smart, because he'd never built himself a cushion. I helped him where I could, but it ate him alive. He told me once, "Colton, I'd give anything to go back 10 years and save $1 from every week, just $1. The old cowboy head bowed a little, the fire glow casting lines across his weathered face. That stuck with me. It ain't the big wins that change a man's life, it's the small, steady ones. That's why I preach it, even when no one asking. Not to brag, not to scold, just to keep good men from falling into the same trap. A log cracked in the fire, sending sparks upward like tiny stars. Colton leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and continued, his voice now slow as honey. You know what wealth really is, boys? It's time. Time to sit by a fire without worrying what tomorrow brings. Time to walk with your children, teach them, laugh with them. Time to rest easy knowing you earned your peace. Money only the tool, but time, that's the treasure, and the only way to buy it is with discipline and patience. The rain outside thickened for a moment, the sound like 1,000 tiny drums, then eased again, leaving only the hiss of water meeting earth. Colton's eyes grew heavy, but he pressed on, as though the story itself needed to be told before the night ended. I'll leave you with this. Think of wealth like a campfire. You can burn it bright with big logs, and it'll roar for a while, but it'll die quick if you don't tend it. Or you can start with kindling, feed it steady, keep it alive. Do that, and you'll have warmth all night. Money the same. Burn it fast, and it's gone. Build it careful, and it'll last as long as you need it. And when you've got that fire burning steady, you'll find you don't need to chase the wind anymore. The world will come to you. He leaned back once more, letting the silence return. The boys breathed deep in their sleep. The rain lulled the night, and the fire dimmed to a soft glow. And in that quiet, Colton smiled faintly, the peace of a lifetime lesson settling in his chest like a final, gentle truth. The night deepened, shadows stretching long across the campfire circle, and the old cowboy words seemed to hang in the air, mingling with the hiss of rain and the soft crackle of burning wood. Colton shifted again, leaning back against the rough timber post behind him, his hat tilted low, but his voice carried steady, as if he were speaking to some unseen listener who just wandered close to the fire. There's something folks don't always see clear, he began, his tone low like the rumble of thunder far off. A man's worth ain't measured by how much gold he can pile in a chest. It's measured by what he does with it. Money left alone is just metal or paper. It's the choices you make with it, the lives you ease, the dreams you build, the storms you ride out, that give it meaning. I've seen men clutch their dollars so tight their knuckles turned white, yet they never lived a day free. And I've seen others who spent without thinking and wound up broken, blaming the world, the truth in the middle. Save with purpose, spend with care. That's where the real wealth lies. He paused to poke the embers with a stick, coaxing out a flare of orange light. The glow lit his worn face, deep lines carved by wind, time, and lessons hard-earned. I remember riding with a fellow named Hartwell, he continued, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. He was quick with numbers, quicker with cards, could turn $10 into $100 by noon, then lose it all by sundown. One night, we sat just like this, rain pounding on the tin roof of an old barn. I asked him plain, why keep playing when you know the end is always the same? He laughed, said it was the thrill that kept him alive. Well, I reckon thrill don't buy bread. A year later, I heard he was begging for work, pockets empty, eyes hollow. Not because he was unlucky, because he mistook luck for discipline. That a mistake no man should make twice. The rain softened again, now more like a gentle murmur against the earth. Colton's voice lowered, drawling slower, as if coaxing sleep from the shadows. They're a lesson in the land itself, boys. Take seeds. You don't toss them in the dirt and expect a harvest come morning. You tend them, water them, guard them from the crows. Day after day you work, seeing little for your trouble. But one morning when the sun hits just right, green shoots push through, and suddenly you got a field coming alive. Money the same. Planted in the right soil, good work, steady saving, wise choices. And though you may not see much at first, one day you'll wake up to find you've grown yourself a harvest. Trouble is, too many folks give up before the sprouting. They walk away from the field, calling it barren, when all it needed was patience. Colton let the fire crackle for a spell, his words sinking into the quiet like rain soaking deep into the earth. When he spoke again, it was softer still, like a lullaby wearing boots. There's comfort in knowing your efforts don't vanish with the wind. Every coin saved, every debt paid, every moment you chose work over waste, it stacks up, even if you can't see it, like building a cabin log by log. Might not look like much at the start, just a pile of timber, but one day, you got walls, a roof, a place to keep warm in the storm. And let me tell you, when that storm comes, and it always does, you'll be mighty glad you laid those logs one by one, steady and sure. The fire sputtered as a log shifted, sending sparks into the air. Colton's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, his voice slowing, as if he too were drifting toward dreams. So if you take nothing else from this old man rambling, take this wealth ain't about living rich, it about living steady. It about building a fire that don't burn out, no matter how long the night lasts. Do that, and you'll find peace worth more than all the gold in the hills. He leaned back, folding his hands across his chest, the sound of rain and fire carrying the story further than words ever could. The night seemed to hold its breath, letting the lesson settle, soft and sure, into the bones of all who listened, even if their ears were already deep in dreams. The fire dimmed lower, the flames licking softer now, but Colton's voice carried just the same, worn and gravelly, like a wagon wheel rolling down an old dirt road. He shifted his weight, stretched his boots out toward the fire, and let the hush of the rain fill the silence before speaking again. Now I reckon folks sometimes get it backwards, he said, his drawl slow, each word measured like a man counting coins. They chase after riches, thinking the end goal is a mountain of gold they can sit atop like a king. But wealth, real wealth, ain't about what you hold, it about what you build. It's the difference between gathering rocks in your pockets and laying stones for a bridge that'll carry you across the years. He paused, eyes fixed on the sparks dancing up into the dark sky. I once rode with a rancher named Silas, fine man, but he carried himself like a storm cloud, always worried about losing what he had. Spent every hour of the day watching his herds, counting his coins, fretting over every deal. Truth was, he had more than enough, but he never let himself rest easy. One night, after a long drive, he asked me if I thought he'd ever feel satisfied. I told him plain, Silas, wealth without peace is like water in a leaking bucket. No matter how much you pour in, it won't ever fill. Took him a long time to see it, but eventually, he started spending less time worrying and more time living. Funny thing, when he did, his fortunes grew steadier, and so did his smile. The rain pattered heavier on the canvas lean-to stretched nearby, steady as a drum. The cowboy tone softened, drawing out the words like a lullaby. Truth is, life don't hand you a map to fortune. What it does give you is chances. A chance to save instead of spend, to learn instead of gamble, to stand firm instead of folding. Each choice might feel small, like a drop in the rain, but enough drops fill a barrel. And one day you'll find that barrel brimmeth over, all because you chose steady drops instead of wasting them in the dirt. He leaned forward, poking the fire again, coaxing the embers into a soft glow. I knew a young hand once, named Dawson, barely 20, full of dreams bigger than his boots could carry. He wanted riches quick, gold, land, fancy clothes, all of it. Tried schemes, get-rich plans, even gambled away a year's wages in one night. When I found him sitting alone by the trail, pockets empty, I told him a story about planting an orchard. Told him, boy, you don't get apples the day you put the seed in the ground. Takes years of care before you get a harvest worth picking. But once the orchard grown, it feeds you every season. He didn't take to it right away, but years later I rode past a homestead and saw Dawson standing tall on land of his own, a small orchard growing strong behind him. He waved at me with a grin, and I knew he'd found the patience to tend his fortune slow. Colton sighed, the sound deep and long, like the last note of a fiddle carried on the wind. They're a kind of freedom that comes with steady wealth, he said. Not the kind that buys every trinket in a shop, but the kind that lets you sleep easy on nights like this. No fear of hunger, no dread of debt hanging over your head. Just the quiet knowledge that you've built enough to keep the fire going, to keep the rain from soaking through the roof. That, my friends, is worth more than all the gold a prospector could dream up. He leaned back once more, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders. The campfire crackled low, the rain hummed its gentle song, and his words seemed to weave into the very air, drifting like smoke into the night. "So take it slow," he whispered, voice nearly a murmur now. "Stack your logs, save your coins, build your field, tend your orchard. Let time be your partner, not your enemy. Do that, and one day you'll sit by a fire like this, listening to the rain, and you'll feel the kind of peace no money can buy. That the story worth telling, that the wealth worth dreaming into." The night grew quiet again, only the rain and the fire speaking now, and the old cowboy words lingered long after he fell silent, a gentle guide for dreamers drifting off beneath the endless sky. The rain eased into a softer drizzle, like the earth itself was taking a slow breath, and Colton tilted his hat back, letting the glow of the fire dance across his weathered face. His voice carried steady, a low hum of truth wrapped in the rhythm of an old cowboy cadence. "I'll tell you something else," he began, scratching idly at his beard. "A man's fortune ain't measured just in coins or cattle. It measured in the habits he builds, the quiet choices no one sees. You spend $1 today on whiskey, it gone by morning. You put that same dollar toward building your future, and it'll feed you many winters down the line. Trouble is, most folks don't see past the flame in front of them. They don't think of the wood pile running low." He leaned down, dropped another log onto the fire, and sparks scattered up into the sky. "Take Ruth and Jeremiah, a couple I knew back in Amarillo. They didn't have much when they started, just a small patch of land and a dream bigger than their means. While neighbors were buying shiny wagons and flashy boots, Ruth and Jeremiah kept patching their old wagon, mending clothes till they couldn't be mended no more. Folks laughed at them, said they were too tight-fisted, too cautious. But each season, Ruth tucked away a little coin in a tin, buried safe under the floorboards. Jeremiah put his hours into improving that patch of land, little by little, plowing straighter rows, learning how to rotate his crops. 10 years passed, and wouldn't you know it, they bought up the land next to theirs when it went cheap. Another decade, and they owned near half the county, while those same neighbors who mocked them were selling wagons just to make ends meet. That's the way steady patience works. It don't make noise, but it sure builds something unshakable. The cowboy stretched, the leather of his coat creaking, and he gave a soft chuckle. Funny thing, folks think wealth comes in storms fast and furious, like a lightning strike, but it comes more like rain, drop by drop, steady and sure, till one day you look out and see the river risen, and by then, it ain't luck, it's the weight of all those drops you had the sense not to waste. The drizzle picked up again, pattering like a lullaby against the canvas. Colton's words flowed slower now, more gentle, as if he were letting the night carry the lesson deeper. "Another time, I rode alongside a feller named Benjamin, quiet man, bookish sort, always scribbling notes in a worn ledger he carried everywhere. At first, I thought it odd. Who bothers with numbers when they're cattle to wrangle and fences to mend? But he told me one evening by the fire, 'Colton, if you don't measure what you've got, you can't know where you're headed.' He kept track of every penny earned, every penny spent, every calf born, every acre sown. Seemed tedious, but over the years, those numbers told a story no guessing could have shown. Benjamin spotted patterns, knew which seasons were lean, which were fat, and how to prepare for both. He didn't get rich quick, but he never went broke either. And by the time he was gray, he had a spread large enough to pass to his children, all because he paid attention to the details no one else cared for." The cowboy tapped his boot against the ground, the rhythm slow and thoughtful. "Most folks think of success as a single moment, some big win, some strike of fortune. Truth is, it's a long trail. Some days dusty, some days stormy, some days you feel like laying down and quitting. But if you keep riding, keep walking one step at a time, you'll look back and see you've covered miles more than you thought possible. That's what wealth is, steps taken, day after day, even when they feel small, especially when they feel small." Colton's voice softened to near a whisper, drawl stretching like the fire last flicker. "I reckon the secret ain't a secret at all. Save more than you spend, build more than you break, tend to what you've got, trust the long game. And never forget that the richest folks ain't always the ones with the most. They're the ones who can sit by a fire, listen to the rain, and feel peace settling deep in their bones. That's the kind of wealth that lasts." The cowboy fell quiet, letting the fire crackle and the rain hum its steady song, as if the night itself was finishing the lesson he'd begun. The listeners leaned back, eyelids heavy, dreams starting to drift like smoke into the midnight sky, carrying the old man's words with them.
Jedediah Boone weren't born with much more than a patched-up pair of boots, a weathered hat, and the kind of grit that life on the plains tends to rub into a man. Folks around his hometown, a dusty speck out in the Texas Panhandle, knew him as a quiet fella, one who'd rather mend fences or ride out to check on strays than sit in a saloon jabbering away. He wasn't much for show, but he had a way about him, a steadiness that made even the most scatterbrained ranch hands stop and take note when he spoke. Now Jed, he wasn't raised rich. His pa had a stretch of land that was more rock than grass, and the cattle they kept seemed more intent on dying than thriving. His ma, bless her, stitched clothes till her eyes hurt, and every nickel went back into keeping the place from falling apart. But young Jedediah, he'd sit by the fire at night, listening to the older men tell tales of fortunes found in railroads, cattle drives, and land speculation. And though he didn't say much, his mind was churning like a river after the rains, calculating and dreaming. He worked that ranch till his shoulders grew broad and his hands turned leathery, but all the while he kept a little notebook he carried in his breast pocket. Each payday, each cattle sale, each expense, he'd jot it down careful as a preacher quoting scripture. Folks laughed at him for being so fussy, but Jed knew numbers told stories just as surely as the old cowboys did by the fire. And them numbers whispered to him of patterns of ways to turn hard work into something more. It was in his 24th year when Jed made his first big decision. He'd saved near $200, which for him was a king ransom. Instead of blowing it on whiskey or cards, he bought himself a scrawny plot of land just outside the rail junction. Folks shook their heads, saying it weren't good for cattle nor crops, just dust and sagebrush. But Jed had seen something they hadn't. The railroad was laying new track, and in time that dusty stretch would be sitting right on the road where supplies and travelers poured through. For 2 years, Jed worked double shifts, tending his pa ranch by day and hauling freight by night. He slept on burlap sacks and ate more beans than a man rightly should, but he kept at it. Every dime went into paying off that land and building a small corral, a lean-to, and a shack barely fit for a man. But then the railroad came closer, and with it came merchants, traders, and dreamers. Jedediah, with that steady mind of his, didn't waste no time. He struck a deal with a supplier from back east, ordering barrels of feed, flour, sugar, and tools. He opened the first general store within 30 miles of that rail stop, running it out of his shack with shelves he hammered together himself. Cowboys riding through, settlers making their way west, even railroad men, they all needed supplies. And Jed was there with fair prices and a calm smile. It weren't long before that shack turned into a proper store, and the land that folks had said weren't worth nothing suddenly became the center of a bustling little town. They called it Boone Junction, and the name stuck. Jed bought up adjoining plots whenever he could, expanding bit by bit, never taking more risk than he could stomach. By his 30th year, Jedediah Boone was no longer just a ranch hand's son. He was a landowner, a merchant, and the quiet force behind a town that was growing faster than tumbleweeds in a windstorm. But he never strutted, never bragged. He still wore the same worn boots, still tipped his hat polite-like, and still carried that notebook in his pocket, scribbling every cent that came and went. See, Jed had a philosophy. Money weren't just for spending. Money was seed. Plant it careful, tend it daily, and in time, it'd grow into something mighty. He didn't gamble on quick wins. He built slow, steady, like laying stones for a foundation. Now, there came a spell where the rains didn't fall, and cattle all across the county dropped like flies. Many a rancher went belly up, selling off land for pennies just to stay fed. But Jed, he saw opportunity in that hardship. With the savings from his store, he bought parcels of land at bargain prices. Folks thought he was crazy. What good land with no water? But Jedediah, he'd been talking with a surveyor who whispered about an aquifer sitting deep below. And sure enough, when the drought broke and wells were dug, Jed land turned green faster than a gambler envied. From then on, it weren't just about survival. Jed was building legacy. He invested in cattle drives, in stagecoach routes, even in a small schoolhouse for the town children. He knew education was a kind of wealth too, one that outlasted coin. And every night when the store shutters closed and the fire crackled low, Jedediah would sit with his boots propped up, listening to the rain tap against the tin roof or the coyotes yipping out yonder. He'd run a finger along his notebook-worn spine, smiling faintly as he thought about how far he'd come. Not through luck, not through trickery, but through patience, vision, and the belief that a man could build something bigger than himself if he just kept to it. That, friends, is how Jedediah Boone, a quiet cowboy with nothing but grit and a ledger turned dust into gold, and built a fortune by the steady glow of the campfire and the rain-soaked nights. Jedediah Boone's fortune didn't go unnoticed for long. By the time his general store had grown into a brick-fronted building with a wide porch and hitching post out front, bigger fish from back east started sniffing around Boone Junction. Suits with polished boots and silver watch chains came riding off the rail cars, squinting at the town like they was measuring it up for their ledgers. One such man, name of Silas Trumbull, fancied himself a kingmaker. He'd made his money buying out little towns, running folk into debt, and then owning near every board nailed in the place. Silas was slick as an oilskin coat and twice as cold. He saw Jedediah as some backwoods ranch boy who'd stumbled into luck. "Well now, Mr. Boone," Silas said one afternoon, leaning against Jed's counter, twirling that gold watch of his, "you've done mighty fine here, mighty fine indeed. But a man like you, ain't you tired of the day-to-day grind? Why not sell this here store and land to my company? We'll give you a tidy sum and you can take it easy the rest of your days." Jedediah listened quiet, same as he always did. He didn't bristle, didn't laugh, just folded his hands atop the counter and asked calm, "And what happens to the folks of this town, Mr. Trumbull, when you run it?" Silas grinned, showing too many teeth. "Why, progress, of course. My company will raise prices, make improvements, bring in outside labor. The whole place will be turned into a proper city in no time." Jed's eyes narrowed, though his voice stayed steady. "Progress don't mean much if the people building it can't afford to eat." And with that, he politely showed Silas the door. See, Jedediah weren't building just for himself. Every nail hammered in Boone Junction, every acre of land he bought, it was with the idea that prosperity ought to be shared. He believed a man's fortune weren't measured by the coins in his strongbox, but by how many folks thrived because he'd been there. That kind of thinking baffled slick businessmen like Trumbull, but it bound Jed to his town tighter than any contract. Still, Jed knew he couldn't stop progress from knocking. Railroads were spreading like wildfire, and with them came opportunity and danger both. So Jed adapted. He partnered with other merchants in nearby towns, creating a kind of cooperative. Instead of competing cutthroat, they pooled resources, buying goods in bulk, sharing transport, keeping prices fair for settlers and cowboys alike. It weren't just smart business, it was a shield against vultures like Trumbull. But being a pioneer of finance out west didn't mean Jed was spared hardship. One particularly harsh winter, snow piled so high wagons couldn't make it through the passes. Supplies dwindled and hunger scratched at the doors of Boone Junction. Folks began to panic. Some muttered that Jed should have sold to Trumbull when he had the chance, for surely a big company could have hauled in more goods. Jed didn't flinch. He dipped deep into his own reserves, opening his storerooms and rationing flour, beans, and salted pork to every family, settling accounts on credit that he never once called in full. "Ain't no use being rich in a town that's starving," he'd say, handing out supplies with a calm nod. When spring finally broke and wagons rolled in again, Boone Junction hadn't lost a single soul to hunger. The gratitude folks felt for Jed only deepened their loyalty, and word spread up and down the rail line. Before long, Boone Junction was known not just as a prosperous stop, but as a place where a man could build a life without fear of being bled dry. Now, Jed could have taken that reputation and turned it into something flashy. He could have built himself a mansion on the hill, hired guards, strutted through town like a cattle baron. But he never did. He still lived in a modest house just behind the store, still wore boots that had seen better days, and still carried that same battered notebook. That notebook, well, had grown thick with years of numbers, but also scribbled thoughts, bits of wisdom Jed collected. Things like a coin spent thoughtless is a seed thrown to the wind, or never buy land from a man who's smiling too wide. He wasn't just calculating profit, he was building a philosophy, something he could pass down. As Boone Junction grew, so too did its challenges. Rival towns wanted rail stops diverted their way. Rustlers tried to make off with Jed cattle herds, figuring him soft for being generous. Even the government men came sniffing, wanting taxes and paperwork thicker than a preacher Bible. But through it all, Jedediah Boone met each trial steady as a mountain. He knew storms come and storms go, but the man who holds fast, who plans ahead, who keeps faith with his people, he'll outlast the fiercest gales. And on nights when the wind howled something fierce, rattling the shutters, Jed would sit by the fire, hat tipped low, listening to the storm. He'd think back on them days when all he had was $200, a patch of dust, and a dream, and he'd smile, not boastful, but thankful. thankful that patience, discipline, and a belief in building steady had carried him this far. For Jedediah Boone wasn't just chasing dollars, he was laying down roots deep as oak trees, roots that would hold long after he was gone. As Boone Junction swelled into a bustling frontier hub, Jedediah Boone found himself facing a challenge he'd never rightly expected. His own success was starting to breed envy. Folks who once tipped their hats to him with gratitude now muttered that Jed held too much sway in town. They said he owned too many acres, controlled too much trade, and was setting himself up as king of the valley. Now Jed never aimed to lord over anyone. His heart was always bent toward keeping things fair, giving folks a chance to build their own fortunes. But success has a way of twisting other men's eyes, and sure enough, one of the loudest grumblers was a man Jed had once called friend. Caleb Merriweather had rode into Boone Junction years back with nothing but a saddlebag and a gambler grin. Jed had lent him money for a small livery stable, no interest charged, just a handshake promise. Caleb had done all right, turning that stable into a fine business, buying and selling horses to settlers. But somewhere along the way, envy crept into Caleb's heart. One evening, under the low glow of lanterns in the saloon, Caleb raised his voice. "Ain't no one man ought to own half the land round here," he barked, his words greased by whiskey. "Boone building himself an empire while the rest of us scrape by." Those words carried through town like dry brush catching flame. By morning, whispers spread that Jed was using his wealth to strangle opportunity. Some believed it, others didn't, but Jed knew he had to face it plain. Instead of calling Caleb out, instead of defending himself with bluster, Jed did what he always did. He laid out the books. One Saturday afternoon, he invited the whole town into the store and showed them how every loan he'd given was recorded, how not a soul had been charged more than fair, how he'd never once foreclosed on a struggling settler. "Ain't my aim to own folks," he said steady, looking Caleb square in the eyes. "My aim to see this town stand on its own 2 feet, same as I once tried to do." Some grumbled still, but most nodded, seeing the truth with their own eyes. And Caleb, well, he stormed out, bitterness gnawing deeper into him. It was a wound that take years to fester. Through all that, Jed kept expanding, not for himself, but for Boone Junction. He invested in a proper schoolhouse, her and a schoolmarm from Kansas City who taught the young uns more than just their letters. She taught them reckoning numbers, how to balance accounts, how to dream bigger than just scratching a living off the dirt. He brought in a banker too, but not the kind that skimmed pockets dry. Jed made sure the man understood loans were tools, not chains. Folks could borrow to build, and long as they kept honest effort, the bank would never break them with interest they couldn't pay. By now, Boone Junction had turned into something remarkable. The once sleepy stop was buzzing with blacksmiths, carpenters, seamstresses, cattle traders, and shopkeepers. Travelers stopped not just for supplies, but to marvel at how a little town in the wilderness had built itself into prosperity. And Jedediah, he stayed humble, still wore the same trail-worn hat, still walked the dusty street with a calm nod to every man, woman, and child. But late at night, sitting on his porch, listening to the crickets saw away at the dark, he felt the weight of it all. He wondered if he was building something that could last without him. One stormy night, as thunder rolled over the hills, Jed confided to his old notebook. Wealth is a tricky beast. If a man holds it too tight, it slips through his fingers. If he spreads it too thin, it loses its power. But if he plants it like seed in the right soil, it can outlive him. He was planting seeds all right, but the test would come when storms stronger than weather rolled in. For not long after, rumors drifted through town that the railroad men were planning a new line. If it passed Boone Junction by, prosperity could dry up overnight. And the one man who knew how to sway that decision, none other than Silas Trumbull, the slick businessman Jed had once turned away. Silas hadn't forgotten that slight, and now he held the cards. He promised to bring the rail line through, but only if Jedediah Boone sold his holdings and stepped aside. It was the kind of test that could break even the steadiest of men. And for the first time in many years, Jed felt the sting of doubt. He sat long by the fire that night, the flames crackling, rain tapping on the roof. He thought about Caleb's bitterness, about Silas' greed, about all the families who'd hitched their wagons to Boone Junction, trusting him to lead them through. He wasn't just holding his own future anymore, he was holding the town. And when dawn came, Jed tightened his boots, set his hat firm, and walked out into the gray morning with the resolve of a man who knew sometimes fortune ain't about what you take, but what you're willing to fight for. The morning Jedediah Boone set out to meet with Silas Trumbull was gray as ash and heavy with the smell of wet earth. A storm had passed through the night before, leaving puddles in the wagon ruts and hanging fog in the hollows. Boone rode out slow on his sorrel mare, the town still quiet behind him, the railroad men waiting at the surveyor tent down by the ridge. Silas Trumbull stood there with a cigar clamped in his teeth, boots polished like he never once set foot in the mud. His coat was trimmed finer than any settler could afford, and his smile was the kind that showed no warmth. He looked Boone up and down like he was weighing cattle, not a man.
Well, well, Silas drawled, puffing smoke. Jedediah Boone, the king of this little dirt kingdom. I'll admit you've done a fair job turning Scrublin into something worth looking at. But progress is marching through Boone, and progress don't slow down for sentiment. Jed said nothing at first. He stood steady, eyes fixed on Silas, hands easy at his sides. Silence was a weapon he'd learned to wield better than any pistol. Finally, he spoke low and even. This town ain't mine, Silas. It belongs to the folks who broke their backs building it. You know that. And I ain't about to hand it over to a man who measures worth in dollars alone. Silas smirked, flicking ash into the mud. Then you best prepare to watch it wither. The railroad line goes where I say it goes. I can route it 20 miles south through Riverton, and Boone Junction will be nothing but a dusty memory by next winter. The words hit like a hammer, but Jed resolve didn't waver. Then I reckon we'll find another way, he said, turning to leave. Silas called after him, voice sharp. Don't play the martyr, Boone. You and I both know men follow the rails, not the dirt roads. Without me, your little dream dies. Jed kept walking, but his heart was heavy. He knew Silas was right about one thing. The railroad meant life or death for Boone Junction. Without it, trade would thin, travelers would pass them by, and all they'd built would begin to dry up like a creek in drought. Back in town, Jed gathered the folks in the schoolhouse. The air was thick with worry as he laid out the truth plain. Silas Trumbull means to choke us, he said, his voice steady. He wants me out in our town in his pocket. Now, I ain't willing to sell out, but I won't lie to you. Without the railroad, we'll have to fight tooth and nail to keep this place alive. Murmurs filled the room, fear, anger, doubt. Then a voice rose from the back. It was Sarah McAllister, the schoolmarm, her hands folded tight. Mr. Boone, she said, we've taught these children not just their letters, but to stand on their own. If we give in now, what lesson does that teach? Another voice rang out, Tom Fletcher, the blacksmith. I'll be damned if I let some city slicker tell me my work don't matter. Boone right, we'll find another way. One by one, voices joined in until the schoolhouse was shaken with a rough, determined chorus. Boone felt the weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by something fiercer, resolve not just his own, but the whole town. That night, Jed sat by the fire, scratching in his notebook. A man's wealth ain't just in gold or land, it in the faith folks put in him when the storm comes. And if he don't honor that faith, he ain't worth the dirt on his boots. The days that followed were filled with grit. Boone and the townsfolk drafted letters, pooled what little savings they had, and sent word upriver to men of influence, politicians, land agents, even newspapermen. They painted Boone Junction not as a backwater, but as the heart of a growing frontier, a beacon of honest work and fair trade. And slowly word spread. Weeks later, a representative from the railroad company itself rode in. He was a stout man with spectacles, papers stuffed in his satchel. He met with Jed in the general store, looking over the ledgers, the maps, and the testimonies signed by nearly every settler for miles around. Mr. Boone, he said finally, this town is profitable. More profitable than Riverton, truth be told. You've built something here that draws people, and the railroad follows the people. Silas Trumbull fumed, but the decision was clear. The line would cut straight through Boone Junction. When the first whistle blew months later, echoing off the hills, the town gathered at the platform. Children cheered, women waved kerchiefs, men stood tall with pride. Jed watched as the iron beast thundered in, steam hissing, wheels screeching. It was the sound of survival, the sound of a future secured. But Jedediah Boone didn't puff his chest or claim victory. He simply tipped his hat, eyes moist with quiet relief. He knew this wasn't his triumph alone. It was the triumph of every hand that had built, every back that had bent, every dream that had dared to take root in this wild stretch of land.
That night, sitting by the fire with the stars wide above and the crackle of wood filling the silence, Jed smiled faint. He knew battles would come again, envy, greed, storms of every kind. But he also knew the town was ready for wealth he had learned wasn't just money in a man's pocket. It was hope in the hearts of many, burning steady like a campfire that never quite goes out. The railroad arrival didn't just bring travelers and trade, it brought change, fast and hard. Overnight, Boone Junction shifted from a quiet settlement into a bustling stopover. New faces poured off the trains, merchants, prospectors, drifters looking for fortune, and families hoping to start fresh. The sound of hammers rang through the valley as buildings went up, boarding houses, saloons, a proper hotel, even a bank with brass letters gleaming over the doorway. Jedediah Boone, though, didn't see progress the way most folks did. Where others saw quick profit, he saw the risks that came with it. He'd spent too long wrestling this land into something steady to let greed tear it apart. So instead of rushing into the saloon trade or gambling halls like some townsfolk did, Jed put his money into things that would last. Grain storage, livestock, and a mill down by the creek. His aim wasn't flash, but stability. When the first bank opened, Silas Trumbull,
though bitter from losing his grip on the railroad deal, tried to weasel in by offering loans with high interest. Some settlers, dazzled by the promise of fast growth, took the bait. They borrowed more than they could pay, betting on quick riches. Jed warned him plain, sitting outside the store one evening. A man ought to measure twice before cutting wood, he said, spitting tobacco into the dirt. Same goes for borrowing coin. Debt like a rope. It can pull you out of a hole, but it can just as easy hang you. Some listened, many didn't. And soon enough, Silas had his hooks in more than a few neighbors, holding notes over their heads like storm clouds. Jed refused his offers outright, putting every dollar he earned back into things the town needed, like a school expansion and better roads to the farms. Folks shook their heads at his caution, but when the first bad season came, it was Jed Grain Store that kept bellies full, and Jed Forsythe that steadied Boone Junction. The town prospered because it grew slow and true, like a tree that digs deep roots before reaching for the sky. Years rolled on, and Jed grew older, his hair silvering under his wide-brim hat. He was no rich baron, but he was comfortable, respected, and trusted. He never kept more than he needed, always plowing profit back into the soil of the community. He believed true wealth wasn't in having more, but in building something that could outlast a man-owned breath. One evening, sitting by the fire with the wind whistling through the cottonwoods, Jed wrote again in that battered notebook of his, "Gold may slip through a man's fingers, but legacy is held in the calloused hands of those you leave behind. If I die tomorrow, I'd rather be remembered as the man who built a school than the man who owned a vault." That philosophy carried him into the later years, where younger men and women, his apprentices, neighbors, even those who once doubted him, began to pick up his ways. Caleb Rawlins, a wiry farm boy, learned grain trading at Jed's side. Martha Ellis, the widow who ran the boarding house, worked with him to teach townsfolk how to keep ledgers and books. Boone Junction became known not for reckless riches, but for steady growth. Silas Trumbull, meanwhile, grew desperate. His ventures, saloon chains, mining partnerships, and crooked land grabs made quick money but collapsed just as quick. He tried to lure Jed into his schemes more than once. Their fortune in risk, Boone Silas sneered one night over whiskey, "But you've no stomach for it." Jed leaned back, eyes calm as river stone. A man with no stomach for risk don't mean he's weak. It means he's strong enough to let temptation pass. You'll learn that someday if greed don't eat you first. Sure enough, Silas' empire crumbled within the decade. His debts mounted, his allies abandoned him, and by the time Jed Beard turned white, Silas was a shadow of the man he'd once been. A warning whispered around the fire. Jed, by contrast, had built something that wouldn't crumble, not just barns and mills, but a way of thinking. When he finally passed the mill on to Caleb Rawlins, he didn't just hand him a deed, he handed him that worn notebook filled with years of hard-earned wisdom. Caleb sat by the fire that night, turning the pages, hearing Jed's voice in every line. Wealth ain't just what you stack, it's what you share, it's the roots you leave for others to climb. The years ahead saw Boone Junction grow into a proper town with paved streets, a church bell that rang every Sunday, and a depot that bustled with trains coming and going. And though Jed Boone grew frail, walking with a cane, he'd sit on the porch of the general store, nodding at children running by, watching the dream he once whispered into the dark come alive before his eyes. His story became part of the town story, told by firelight, whispered in prayer, carried on the wind when the trains whistled through the valley. Not of a man who grew rich, but of a man who made others rich in hope, in work, in legacy. And long after the campfires died down, that was the kind of wealth that never faded. Caleb Rawlins had always looked up to Jedediah Boone like a man might look up to a mountain distant, unshakable, a figure that seemed carved from the land itself. When Jed placed the mill keys in Caleb's hand and slid that battered notebook across the table, the young man felt the weight of more than a business. He felt the weight of a promise. At first, Caleb wasn't sure he could live up to it. He was still wiry, still green in some ways, with the rough edges of youth not yet worn smooth. He'd grown up in the valley, working long hours on his family farm, and his hands bore the calluses of honest labor. But leading, owning, being the man others turned to, that was different. Jed must have seen the doubt in his eyes that day. The old man leaned forward, his face a map of wrinkles etched deep by sun and wind, and said, "Don't reckon you gotta be me, boy. You just gotta be you. But you hold fast to what this book tells you. Them pages ain't just words, they're proof that steady hands can build a life worth remembering." And so Caleb set about learning, not only from the notebook, but from the very rhythm of the town itself.
The mill became his classroom, every sack of grain a lesson in trust, patience, and fairness. Farmers came to him, some old enough to be his father, and he treated each with the respect Jed had drilled into him. He kept his scales honest, never shortened a man an ounce, and folks noticed. Word spread that Rawlins ran his mill like Boone before him, solid, fair, reliable. But Caleb also had his own streak of vision. He looked beyond the mill walls, beyond even the town. Where Jed had steadied Boone Junction, Caleb began to think about growth. He saw the trains rattling through, loaded with goods bound for cities farther east. He realized the mill grain could feed more than just the valley. It could feed entire regions if only he could figure the logistics. He began writing letters to merchants in the bigger towns, and soon shipments rolled out, small at first, then larger, until Boone Junction was known in places its founders never dreamed of. The money flowed steadier than the river in spring, but Caleb didn't lose himself in it. He kept his boots on the ground, remembering Jed's words about roots. With the profits, he didn't build a mansion or waste coin in gambling halls. He expanded the school again, paid to bring in teachers, and even helped fund a doctor office. Folks saw that when Rawlins prospered, they prospered too. Still, with growth came risk. Not everyone in Boone Junction played by the same rules. A new figure rolled into town, a sharp-dressed investor named Victor Harlan. Unlike Silas Trumbull, who'd been born of the same dust as the settlers, Harlan was polished, city-bred, with a tongue like honey and eyes like knives. He came pitching deals that promised big returns, factories, land speculation, mining ventures in the hills. Some townsfolk were dazzled, remembering their struggles and hoping for quick fortune. But Caleb, sitting by the campfire one night with Jed's notebook open on his lap, read the words scratched on a yellowing page. When a man promises the moon, be wary. Stars don't belong in a man's pocket. What real is what you can touch, what you can build with your hands. So Caleb told Harlan no, politely, firmly, but plain. And when Harlan pressed harder, sneering at his so-called lack of ambition, Caleb just smiled that quiet Boone smile. But not everyone was as cautious. Some neighbors bought into Harlan ventures, selling land or borrowing against their farms. And just as before, when promises failed to pay, debt crushed them like stones. Caleb found himself picking up the pieces, extending credit at the mill to families who could no longer put bread on their tables. He did it not for profit, but for loyalty, because Boone Junction wasn't just a place, it was a community. In the years that followed, Caleb's reputation stretched far. Merchants in distant cities respected his word. Farmers in the valley trusted his handshake more than a banker contract. He built partnerships steady and true, expanding the grain business into livestock, lumber, and even simple tools that made frontier life easier. But what made him most proud wasn't the businesses or the coin. It was riding through town one evening, seeing the glow of lamplight in the windows of a schoolhouse packed with children, hearing the laughter spilling from homes that stood strong through the winters, watching neighbors gather at the mill porch not to argue debts, but to share news, jokes, and songs. That night, sitting by his own fire, Caleb wrote in the notebook, just as Jed had, legacy ain't a monument carved in stone, it's the way a community speaks your name when you're gone. Jed Boone gave me the tools, but the people gave me their trust. May I never break it. And with that, the second chapter of Boone Dream was written, not in ink alone, but in every hearth, every field, every grain sack that rolled out of the valley. The valley had known lean times before, but never like the summer that came when Caleb Rawlins was in his prime. The winter had been mild, the spring blossoms fair, and folks thought it might be a year of plenty. But by mid-June, the rain simply stopped. Day after day, the sky stayed hard and cloudless, the sun beaten down merciless as if it meant to cook the land itself. Creeks shrank to trickles, grass withered to dust, and the mighty river that had fed Boone Junction for generations ran low enough that children could wade across stretches that once swallowed wagons whole. The mill, heart of Caleb's livelihood, slowed to a crawl. Grain came in light, shriveled in the husk. Families that had depended on rich harvests brought him sacks half empty, eyes downcast, ashamed of what they couldn't control. Caleb weighed every bushel with the same care as before, but he could feel the fear under it all, the quiet dread that this drought might not end in a season or even a year. One evening, sitting by the fire with Jed Boone's old notebook open, Caleb traced the ink of words written decades before. A storm will come that no man can bargain with. Then it is not coin nor strength that saves a town, but the will to endure together. He shut the book and made his choice. The next morning, he nailed a sign to the mill door. No family will go hungry. Grain credit extended. Pay when you can. Some called him foolish. Merchants from the city shook their heads, warning he'd ruin himself by giving away his stock. But Caleb knew the truth. Coin could be counted, but trust could not. If Boone Junction lost faith in itself, no ledger could save it. So he opened his storerooms, rationing fairly. He kept careful notes of every sack lent, not as debts to be squeezed, but as markers of trust. Farmers brought what they could, sometimes only eggs, sometimes a side of bacon, sometimes labor in the fields. Caleb accepted it all with a quiet nod, and in that barter, the town remembered its strength. Still, the drought wore hard. Tempers grew short in the heat. A few men, desperate and bitter, began listening again to Victor Harlan, who had stayed in town longer than he was welcome. Harlan whispered that Caleb was hoarding, that the young miller sought to make himself king of the valley. Rumors spread like sparks on dry grass. One night, a small band of men stormed the mill, demanding proof. They wanted to see the storerooms, certain Caleb kept more than he let on. Caleb met them with lantern light in hand, no anger in his voice. "Come on then," he said, leading them inside. He showed them every shelf, every bin, every barrel half empty now, with less each week. "If I were hoarding," he said softly, "I'd be fat while you starved. But look at me. I eat the same bread you do. My family drinks the same thin milk." The men looked around in silence. One by one, shame overtook suspicion. By the time they left, their hats were in their hands, and Harlan's poisonous words lost some of their sting. But Caleb knew suspicion had a way of lingering. He decided then to turn to the very earth itself for hope. He gathered townsfolk under the dry oak by the square and spoke plain. "We built this place together. If we want it to survive, we'll have to work together like never before." He organized crews to dig deeper wells, taught by an old rancher who'd once worked desert land. He led teams to divert what little water the river still gave into irrigation ditches. He bartered with traders for seed hardy enough to weather poor soil, promising repayment not in coin, but in steady shipments once harvests returned. The days were grueling, sweat-soaked, and bone-tiring. But in the midst of hardship, something remarkable happened. The town pulled tighter. Neighbors who once only nodded across fence lines now worked shoulder to shoulder in ditches. Families shared meals, no matter how meager, so no child went hungry. And through it all, Caleb was there. His boots were caked in the same dust, his shirt soaked with the same sweat, his back bent under the same loads. Folks began to say he wasn't just running the mill anymore, he was holding the town together with his bare hands. Months dragged on and still the sky refused to give. But by late autumn, dark clouds finally gathered. The first rains in half a year fell heavy, thunder rolling over the valley like a hymn. Children ran out barefoot to dance in the mud while grown men and women wept openly at the sight of water coursing down the dry gullies. The harvest that year was small, but it was enough. Enough to plant again, enough to keep hope alive. In the quiet after the storm, Caleb sat at his desk by lamplight, opening the notebook once more. His hand shook as he wrote, "We survived the drought not by riches, nor by one man's strength, but by the grit of a community that refused to give up on itself. Wealth is measured not by what you hold, but by what you share." The ink dried on the page, but the truth of those words lived on in every heart of Boone Junction. The town would never forget the drought, but neither would it forget how it endured, together, with Caleb Rawlins leading not as a ruler, but as one of their own. The drought broke, and with it came not only rain, but whispers of change drifting in from the east. Men riding through Boone Junction spoke of iron rails stretching across the land, steel veins carrying trains faster than any horse could run. The railroad was coming, they said, and no valley, no town, no humble farm would remain untouched once the whistle blew. At first, it sounded like salvation. Merchants dreamed of new markets, farmers of selling their grain beyond the county line. Even the innkeeper, old Miss Clara, pictured her modest tavern filled with travelers spilling coin. Boone Junction, so long a quiet outpost, might just step onto the map. But Caleb Rawlins knew progress carried shadows. He'd seen the greed of men like Victor Harlan, who'd left town but whose schemes echoed still. The railroad promised opportunity, but it also promised vultures looking to snatch up land, to turn neighbors against each other for the shine of quick coin. One crisp morning, a man in a black coat stepped off a wagon and pinned a broadside to the post outside the general store. Western Pacific Railroad to lay track through Boone Junction, land negotiations to commence. By sundown, half the town was gathered in the square, buzzing with excitement and fear. Some shouted that it meant prosperity. Others muttered that the valley piece would be sold to the highest bidder. Caleb listened, arms folded, leaning against a hitching post. He didn't rush to speak. Instead, he walked the length of the square, meeting eyes, letting folks see his calm when theirs were wild. When at last the crowd quieted, he stepped up onto the porch of the store. "Friends," he began, voice steady as a river stone, "we've weathered droughts and storms, thieves and doubts. This here railroad may bring us fortune, or it may bleed us dry, but the choice ain't theirs, it's ours. We decide what Boone Junction becomes. There was silence, then a murmur of agreement. Folks knew Caleb didn't speak in fancy talk. When he opened his mouth, it was truth that came out. Still, the weeks that followed tested that truth. Representatives from the railroad rode in, wearing fine hats and slick smiles, papers tucked under their arms. They offered buyouts to farmers, good sums, more money than some had ever seen. A few, weary from years of thin harvest, signed without hesitating. Others looked to Caleb. He advised patience, but he never ordered. A man's land is his own, he said, but know what you're giving up, and know what it costs not just you, but your neighbor. Soon enough, the valley split. Some leaned toward selling, some swore they'd never give up their homesteads. The tavern filled each night with heated words, and more than once fists flew. Caleb spent long evenings at his mill, lamplight spilling through the cracks as he pored over contracts, teaching himself the law by firelight. He wrote letters to men he trusted in nearby towns, gathering knowledge on how railroads operated. If Boone Junction was to face this storm, he meant to face it informed. Then came the day when the railroad men approached him direct. They sat across from him in his office, their suits too fine for the dusty chairs, eyes sharp as hawks. Mr. Rawlins once said, "Smooth as butter, you're the pillar of this community. We'd like your partnership. Sell us your mill and we'll build you a grander one by the tracks. You'll be rich, influential, the very man who brought prosperity here." Caleb's jaw tightened. He thought of the townsfolk who'd leaned on him through drought, the children who'd danced in the rain, the trust he'd earned not by taking but by giving. "Gentlemen," he said slowly, "I built this mill with calloused hands, same as my father and his before him. It don't run on greed, but on the grain of folks who trust it. If you aim to lay tracks through Boone Junction, you'll do it with respect for the people who call it home. And if that ain't in your plans, then you'll find me standing in your way." The men exchanged looks, their smiles thinner now. They left without shaking his hand, but Caleb knew it was only the beginning. In the months that followed, pressure mounted. Land disputes tangled neighbors, and some who'd never quarreled now refused to look each other in the eye. Rumors spread that the railroad would bring lawmen from outside, and maybe even guns, to settle things if need be. Through it all, Caleb remained steady. He held meetings in the square, letting every man and woman speak their piece. He urged patience, urged unity, urged folks to remember that Boone Junction wasn't built by outsiders but by their sweat, their sacrifice, their dreams. Yet the hardest trial wasn't the railroad men, it was doubt. Alone at night, Caleb sometimes stared at his emptying grain bins, wondering if he was a fool to resist. Maybe wealth, quick and certain, was better than fighting for soil that had betrayed them with drought before. But then he'd remember the faces of those children running barefoot in the rain, the quiet pride in neighbors who'd shared their last loaf with each other. And he'd whisper to the silence, "Some things can't be sold." So Caleb stood firm, even as the sound of hammers on steel drifted closer with each passing season. The whistle of progress would one day echo in Boone Junction, but whether it sang of fortune or ruin, that was yet to be written. And in that uncertainty, the fire of Caleb Rawlins burned brighter, steady as the lanterns he lit each night to remind his people that darkness never had the final say.
The freight king of Dust Valley. The firelight licked along the grain of old pine logs as the rain whispered against the roof. Out there in the dark, the desert stretched wide and empty, but here in the circle of glow sat a story worth more than silver. A story about a man named Clint Mercer, who built fortune not by digging for gold nor chasing cattle, but by hauling what no one else thought worth the trouble. Clint wasn't a prospector, wasn't a rancher, wasn't even much of a fighter. Folks said he was plain, with shoulders bent from long work and hands always dirty with dust. He had no ranch to his name, no rich kin to lean on, and no stash of silver hidden under the floorboards. All he had was a mule named Sally, a wagon that rattled like loose bones, and a mind that saw need where others only saw nuisance. The story goes that Clint arrived in Dust Valley during a time when men were fevered with gold dreams. The hills rang with picks and shovels, and saloons overflowed with miners eager to spend their findings. But Clint, he didn't bring a pan or pickaxe. He brought rope, barrels, flour, salt, and boots. At first, folks laughed at him. "You'll never strike it rich selling oats when there's gold in the river," they'd say. Clint only smiled, tipped his dusty hat, and muttered, "Gold don't move itself. Men can't eat rocks." He started small, hauling sacks of flour from a town 50 miles east, selling them to miners at twice the price. The roads were rough, the sun unforgiving, and the nights filled with coyotes. More than once he nearly lost his load to bandits or broken wheels. But he learned quick how to patch a wagon with rawhide, how to guard his goods with nothing more than grit and a steady stare, and how to make deals in the dark with men desperate enough to pay dearly for bread. Clint's fortune wasn't in the flash of one lucky strike. It was in the steady clatter of his wagon wheels. Every journey brought him closer to understanding what Dust Valley truly needed. Not just food, but rope for mines, lantern oil for tunnels, nails for shacks, whiskey for tired bones, and blankets for the bitter winters. He never wasted a mile. If he brought flour west, he'd carry back timber east. If he hauled whiskey up the hills, he'd load his wagon with ore to sell in the cities. No road was ever traveled empty, no day ever left uncounted. Folks started to notice. They began calling him the mule driver, half in jest, half in awe. Over time, Clint bought another mule, then another. With each coin he saved, he didn't buy finer boots or softer beds. He bought wagons, wheels, and iron nails. Soon, where there had been one rattling cart, there were 5, creaking their way through the valley like a slow, stubborn army. And Clint, he wasn't just hauling goods anymore. He was building routes. He mapped the streams, measured the slopes, marked the shelters, and knew which trails would flood after a storm. He memorized the land like a banker memorizes figures until no road was strange to him and no mile wasted. Now, fortune don't come without hardship. Bandits grew bold, knowing Clint wagons carried value. There were nights when gunshots split the desert silence and mornings when wheels lay broken from sabotage. More than once, Clint thought about giving it all up, heading east where the roads were safer. But every time he sat by his fire, he'd hear the rumble of miners in town, cursing the shortage of flour, whiskey, or boots. Where their hunger, he'd mutter, their opportunity. A man just has to be stubborn enough to answer it. So he hired riders, not gunmen eager for blood, but steady hands who could steer a wagon, mend a wheel, and keep a cool head when steel flashed in the moonlight. He paid them fair, fed them well, and treated them like kin. Slowly, Dust Valley learned if Clint Mercer wagons rolled in, supplies would follow. And with supplies, the town itself could breathe again. Years rolled by, and Clint freight line stretched farther than Dust Valley. He built way stations where his men could rest, barns where mules could be traded, and small shops that sold to travelers who couldn't wait for the next wagon. He didn't just haul, he built infrastructure. The miners who once laughed now relied on him. The saloon keepers toasted him, and the settlers prayed his wagons would arrive before winter set in. By the time the railroad came pushing west, Clint wasn't ruined by it like other haulers. No, he welcomed it. He struck deals with the railmen, using his wagons to bridge the gaps between the stations and the camps too far for the iron horse to reach. He expanded into freight depots, warehouses, even lending a hand in building the tracks. When folks asked him how he managed it all, he'd shrug and say, I just hauled what needed hauling, kept my eyes open, saved my silver, ain't nothing fancy about it. Clint Mercer never struck a gold vein, never bought a mine, never built a mansion. But when he passed, his freight empire stretched across 3 states, his wagons numbered in the hundreds, and his men swore no boss had ever treated them fairer. He died in a modest cabin, boots by the door, hat on the peg, and a map of his route spread across the table, the veins of trade he had carved into the wild. They called him the Freight King of Dust Valley, though he never crowned himself. And to this day, if you sit by a fire on a rainy night, you might hear the faint creak of wagon wheels on the wind, a steady, stubborn, and full of promise, just like Clint Mercer life. When Clint Mercer wagons became the lifeline of Dust Valley, the town began to change in ways no prospector ever dreamed. See, gold might draw men in, but steady freight is what let them stay. A miner with pockets full of ore couldn't eat without flour, a saloon couldn't keep its doors open without whiskey, and a family settler couldn't face the winter without blankets and coal. Clint understood something most men overlooked. Fortune isn't only in striking gold, yet in moving the essentials that keep gold diggers alive long enough to swing their pick. That was the heart of his fortune, not shiny metal, but everyday goods nobody thought twice about. One autumn, when the roads turned to mud and wagons sank axle deep, miners feared starvation. The town preacher called it punishment from above, and some said Dust Valley would be abandoned. Clint studied the flooded trails by lantern light, scratching marks on a worn map. Where others cursed, he looked for another way. He cut a new road through dry hills, widening old cattle paths and reinforcing them with timber hauled in from a distant mill. Folks thought he was mad, yet within weeks, his wagons rolled into town stacked with flour sacks, dried beans, and salted pork. The people of Dust Valley didn't just see a merchant that day, they saw salvation. Mothers cried,
Fathers lifted Clint onto their shoulders, and even the saloon keepers swore they'd never let his glass go empty again. But Clint didn't bask in glory. He went right back to his maps, muttering, "If a town depends on one road, it already lost. You want prosperity, you build options." That was Clint's way, always thinking 2 winters ahead. As his roots grew, so did the men who worked for him. Clint had no children of his own, but he built a family of drivers, riders, and stable hands. Many were drifters with nowhere to go. Some were failed prospectors, others widowers who'd lost kin to fever or famine. Clint gave them a wage, but more than that, he gave them purpose. He taught them his philosophy. Don't chase luck, build what others rely on. A prospector finds gold once, maybe twice if Providence smiles. But a man who hauls the flour those prospectors eat, he gets paid every time they sit at the table. That's steady money, boys, that wealth with roots. His men carried those words like scripture, passing them along fireside to new recruits. They weren't just freight haulers anymore, they were builders of commerce, the invisible hands that stitched together a scattered frontier. And Clint, though he lived modestly, began to see his influence stretch far beyond his own wagons. Town councils sought his advice on trade routes. Merchants begged him to carry their goods. Even bankers, usually too proud to bow to mule drivers, came knocking at his cabin door, offering loans he never asked for. Clint would chuckle and send them away. "Money lent is a shackle," he'd say. "Money earned is freedom. I'll take freedom every time." There came a winter colder than any in memory. Snow buried the cabins, rivers froze solid, and wolves howled close to town. Trade slowed to a crawl, and men whispered that Dust Valley would finally fall silent. But Clint had prepared years in advance. He'd built storage barns along his routes, stocked with grain, salted meat, and coal. When the storm hit, his men didn't panic. They followed Clint's plan. One wagon after another emerged from the blizzard, lanterns glowing faint against the white. Inside each wagon were supplies that meant the difference between life and death. No miner swung a pick that season, but Dust Valley endured. And when spring thawed the land, the town didn't crumble, it prospered. Families stayed, saloons reopened, children played in the thawed streets, all because Clint thought ahead. From then on, no one called him the mule driver with a sneer. They called him the Freight King. But here the part of Clint's tale that matters most. He never let wealth twist him into greed. Many men, once they taste silver, forget the hunger of their youth. Clint never forgot. He set fair prices, never gouging a starving man, never cheating a widow. His fortune grew slow, but it grew steady, like a tree putting down deep roots. When asked why he didn't raise prices when demand was desperate, Clint would shake his head and answer, "A man who takes advantage today won't be trusted tomorrow." Trust is the only coin that spends everywhere. And it was trust that built his empire stronger than any gold vein. Years rolled on. The railroad finally thundered through Dust Valley, iron wheels shrieking as steam filled the sky. Most freighters cursed the train, swore it ruined them, and sold off their wagons. Clint, though, saw something different. He shook hands with the railroad man and struck a deal that his wagons would haul what the trains couldn't reach, and in return his barns became official depots. What others saw as the end, Clint saw as expansion. His empire didn't shrink, it doubled. His men hauled freight to mines beyond the rail, carried mail to outposts, and even transported lumber for the railroad itself. Clint proved once again that fortune favors not the lucky, but the prepared. By the time Clint grew old, Dust Valley had transformed. Where once stood a ramshackle camp of miners, now rose a bustling town with shops, schools, and families. Merchants thrived, saloons sang every night, and churches rang their bells. Much of it owed itself to the stubborn mule driver who refused to let hunger or distance break the settlement. Clint passed quietly in his cabin, boots by the door, hat hung neat, maps folded on the table. He left no heirs of blood, but a family of freight men and women who carried his name like a banner. On his gravestone, carved simple by his men, were the words, "He hauled what mattered." And in those words lay the heart of wealth, not in chasing glitter, not in gambling with fate, but in finding what folks truly need and delivering it, steady as the rain, sure as the dawn. When Clint Mercer passed, the town of Dust Valley mourned like it had lost its own father. Bells tolled, wagons lined the streets, and men who once drifted with no anchor stood proud, wearing black armbands to honor the man who gave them purpose. Children whispered his name as though it belonged in scripture, and merchants closed their doors for a day, knowing without Clint there'd be no doors at all. But death didn't close his story. Clint left behind no vaults of gold or hidden treasure, only maps, barns filled with tools, and ledgers inked with wisdom. Most men would have divided his fortune, argued over scraps, and sold his wagons for whiskey money. But Clint's apprentices weren't most men. They were his family, bound not by blood but by belief. Foremost among them was Jonah Price, a wiry driver with a sharp eye and a sharper mind. He'd ridden with Clint through blizzards and floods, once hauling medicine across frozen rivers with nothing but grit keeping the wheels turning. Jonah carried Clint lessons like scars, and when the Freight King boot stood empty, it was Jonah who gathered the crew. Around the fire that night, rain pattering on the canvas above, Jonah spoke words Clint might have said himself. Clint gave us a trade, but more than that, he gave us a creed. We ain't just hauling goods, we're hauling trust. If we keep that alive, Clint ain't gone. He riding with us still. The men nodded, and so it was decided the Mercer Freight Company would live on. Years passed, and under Jonah's hand, Clint Empire didn't wither, it grew. The railroad stretched further west, and Jonah struck deals just as Clint had, ensuring their wagons carried freight where iron tracks couldn't reach. They built outposts in distant towns, each one stamped with a simple sign, Mercer Freight, steady as the dawn. That phrase became more than a slogan. To settlers, it was a promise. No matter the storm, no matter the distance, Mercer Freight would deliver. Families saved for months just to ride their wagons into new lands, knowing that with Mercer men on the trail, they wouldn't starve on the journey. Miners counted on Mercer barns for supplies. Ranchers relied on their wagons to bring salt and tools. Even lawmen, weary of outlaw raids, trusted Mercer drivers to keep the frontier from starving. Jonah kept Clint's philosophy alive. Prices fair, wages steady, no man left hungry on the road. And though he became wealthy by any measure, Jonah lived as plain as Clint. A small cabin, a warm fire, and a ledger filled not with debts owed but with lessons carried forward. But the frontier, as always, had a way of testing men. A new rival rose, a slick banker named Horace Vail, who bought up freight companies and squeezed towns dry with high rates. He laughed at the old Mercer ways, mocking Jonah honesty. "Trust don't buy iron," Horace would sneer. "Gold does, and I'll have it all." Vail wagons were painted bright, his riders wore polished boots, and his posters promised speed. For a season, many towns turned away from Mercer Freight, lured by cheaper promises. Jonah didn't panic, didn't beg. He gathered his crew and reminded them of Clint's words, "Fortune favors the steady. A man who takes advantage today won't be trusted tomorrow." Sure enough, Vail wagons broke down, his drivers skipped towns, and his promises turned hollow. When a blizzard struck, Mercer Freight alone delivered, their lanterns glowing through the snow. Townsfolk who once doubted came crawling back, and Vail Empire crumbled as fast as it rose. Trust had outlasted greed once more. Jonah grew older, his hair turning silver under the wide-brimmed hat. Before he passed, he called the next generation of freight riders together. Around another campfire, with rain hissing on the coals, he spoke slow and steady. "Clint taught me, and I taught you. Wealth ain't measured in gold stacked or barns filled. Wealth is measured in folks remembering your word as good as the sunrise. If you hold to that, Mercer Freight won't just outlast me, it'll outlast this whole frontier." And so the creed carried on. Decades later, long after railroads crisscrossed the land and towns grew into cities, Mercer Freight still rolled on. The wagons had changed, now iron wheels, steam engines, and later motor cars bore the name. But the principle never wavered. When others cut corners, Mercer delivered. When others gouged prices, Mercer stayed fair. Through wars, depressions, and droughts, the name carried weight. And every driver, no matter if he rode a mule, a wagon, or an engine, learned the old line by heart: "We haul what matters." Clint Mercer, the mule driver who once scratched maps by lantern light, became more than a man. He became a lesson, a story told around fires and in classrooms, a whisper to young dreamers that true fortune ain't in chasing glitter, but in building steady, in earning trust, and in delivering what others need most. Generations passed, the world grew unrecognizable, but his wisdom echoed, soft as rain on a cabin roof, strong as a campfire glow in the dark. Don't chase luck, build trust, all what matters. And with that creed, the Freight King legacy rode on forever. By the turn of the century, the land had changed. Where Clint wagons once carved lonely trails, steel rails now cut across plains like endless silver snakes. Steam whistles replaced the call of mule drivers, and city skylines climbed higher than the smoke from 100 campfires. Yet still, wherever men gathered and goods were needed, the name Mercer carried weight. Jonah Price apprentices had grown into seasoned men, and their sons and daughters now wore the Mercer badge, no longer stitched on dusty coats but painted proudly on locomotives and freight depots. In towns that sprouted where Clint once camped, you'd find a Mercer warehouse, not flashy, not gilded, but sturdy and reliable. Folks said Clint Ghost must have been watching over, For while other companies boomed and busted with the fever of speculation, Mercer Freight grew slow and steady like crops watered with care. They never rushed, never overpromised, never cut corners. And when panics rattled the markets, when banks shuddered and fortunes vanished overnight, Mercer stood steady. Their workers never missed pay, their contracts never broke, and their wagons, now rail cars, rolled on. That reputation carried across states like a wind-blown tail. Businessmen who'd lost everything in reckless ventures sought steady partnerships with Mercer. Families entrusted their savings, their very livelihoods, to shipments marked with the old horse and lantern emblem. And though gold piled high in Mercer vaults, the company never chased extravagance. The wealth was reinvested, new lines laid, new barns raised, new hands hired. But prosperity brought temptation. Not everyone who bore the Mercer name stayed true to Clint Creed. It was in the second generation, under a man named Thomas Tom Mercer, Clint's nephew, that cracks began to show. Tom was clever, sharp with figures, and ambitious. He wore fine suits and smoked imported cigars, speaking less of trust and more of opportunity. Some said he never truly knew Clint, only the legend. He saw the empire not as a sacred trust, but as a machine to be driven harder, faster. Under his watch, wages were squeezed, routes were expanded beyond reason, and flashy ventures drained coffers. It was Jonah's grandson Caleb Price who noticed first. Caleb had been raised on Clint tales, slept under wagon canvas as a boy, and rode engines as a man. When Tom began undercutting contracts and signing deals with questionable partners, Caleb spoke up. "This ain't Clint way," he warned one night, standing in Tom's office while rain lashed the windows. "You're chasing shine when you ought to be building steady. A company without trust is a wagon without wheels. Don't matter how much freight you load, it won't roll." But Tom, puffing his cigar, only laughed. "Caleb, you're stuck in the past. The world moving faster now. We either keep up or get trampled." The split was clear. Some followed Tom's vision of speed and profit. Others, like Caleb, clung to Clint's creed of trust and steadiness. The storm broke during the panic of 1907. Banks collapsed like dominoes, speculators lost fortunes overnight, and Tom's risky deals came due. While other freight houses shuddered, Mercer Freight itself wobbled for the first time in history. Routes were abandoned, workers went unpaid, and towns that had counted on Mercer began to doubt. It was then that Caleb, with a voice steady as Clint had been, stepped forward. He sold his own holdings, rallied loyal workers, and kept the trains running even without pay. He sat in barns with farmers, promising them that Mercer wouldn't abandon their crops. He rode storm-lashed lines himself, hauling food into starving mining towns. Slowly the tide turned. Word spread that though Mercer Freight had faltered under Tom's hand, Clint Creed was alive in Caleb. Towns returned, contracts renewed, and workers rallied behind him.
Tom, disgraced, faded into history. Caleb rebuilt, slower this time, brick by brick, contract by contract. By the 1920s, Mercer Freight had not only recovered, but expanded into a new kind of enterprise motor trucks. At first, folks laughed at the sputtering machines, wheels sinking in mud, engines choking on dust. "Ain't no wagon but with less soul," the old drivers grumbled. But Caleb saw something different. He saw wagons that didn't tire, machines that could run day and night, bridging towns the rails couldn't reach. He invested carefully, building motor depots alongside barns, training wagon drivers to handle engines. And true enough, as roads improved, trucks carried Mercer Creed further than horses ever had. Where rail ended, Mercer trucks rolled. Where trucks stopped, wagons still carried. A network grew, seamless, steady, honest. By then, Clint Mercer had been gone nearly 70 years, yet his name had become a proverb. Bankers wrote it into ledgers as shorthand for honesty. Preachers quoted him in sermons. Children in schoolhouses wrote essays about the freight king who taught a frontier that wealth came not from greed, but from trust. The Depression struck hard, but Mercer Freight endured again, not by luck, but by creed. When others fired workers, Mercer cut wages evenly so no one was abandoned. When farmers couldn't pay cash, Mercer accepted crops, timber, or even labor as fair. In return, when the economy revived, loyalty bound tighter than steel rails. By the time Caleb passed, the Mercer legacy had entered a new century, with its boots still muddy, its hands still calloused, and its reputation untarnished. On nights when storms rattled windows and the wind howled across the plains, old drivers still gathered around fires. They'd sip coffee, boots stretched toward the flames, and tell newcomers the same story of Clint Mercer, who started with mules, and maps scratched in lantern light, who proved that trust could outlast gold, and whose creed carried wagons, trains, and trucks across generations. And every so often, a young driver would ask, but what happens when times change again, when machines replace us altogether? The older men would smile and shake their heads. Machines don't earn trust, men do. And as long as Mercer men keep hauling steady, there'll always be a place for us. And with that, the firelight glowed warm, rain pattered steady, and Clint Ghost rode on unseen but never forgotten. The Second World War came like a thunderstorm across the land, and every railroad, every truck line, every shipyard was called upon. Mercer Freight, by then a seasoned name, answered without hesitation. They hauled tanks eastward, food westward, steel and coal to the heartland, and munitions to the coast. Men who had once carried grain and cattle now hauled war cargo, knowing each load mattered. And true to Clint creed, Mercer never once gouged, never once broke faith. While others sought quick profit in wartime contracts, Mercer signed steady agreements, fair prices, honest deliveries. It cost them in the short run. But when the war was won and peace returned, folks remembered. Veterans came home and went to work for Mercer. Cities rebuilding their industries turned to the name that had never failed them. But the world was changing fast. Planes now crossed the skies. Ocean liners became cargo ships. And in the harbors, a strange new thing appeared, steel containers. Big, ugly boxes, all the same shape and size. At first, the old hands laughed. Where the skill in that? Anyone can haul a box. But once again, Mercer men saw further. They realized those steel boxes could cross from ship to rail to truck without ever unloading. Less theft, less damage, faster deliveries. And so, before most others, Mercer invested. They built container yards, laid tracks to the ports, and bought ships to match their wagons. By the 1960s, Mercer Freight was no longer just a company of rails and roads. It was a network, a web that stretched from Kansas farms to European ports, from Texas oil fields to Asian harbors. Clint horse and lantern emblem now adorned steel containers stacked 5 high on ships bound for oceans he never saw. And still the creed held. We don't chase shine, we carry steady. Yet with growth came danger, not from bandits on trails, but from boardrooms and glass towers. By the 1980s, corporations were merging and swallowing each other whole. Wall Street men in polished shoes eyed Mercer Empire like buzzards on a fence. They saw assets, not heritage, profit margins, not promises. In one famous meeting, a young executive, hair slicked, tie gleaming, leaned across the table at William Mercer. "Great-grandson of Clint, sell to us," he said. "You'll be rich beyond measure. Mercer Freight is old-fashioned. We'll modernize it." William leaned back, his voice calm but firm. "Young man, you can buy wagons, ships, even rails, but you can't buy trust, and that all Mercer really owns." The deal never happened, and while other firms rose fast and fell faster, Mercer endured. Still, not every challenge was so clear. Globalization brought fierce competition. Foreign carriers with cheaper labor undercut routes. Fuel prices swung wild. The world of commerce no longer ran on handshakes but on digital ledgers and complex contracts. And yet, whenever a storm hit, oil crises, recessions, financial crashes, Mercer held steady. They didn't promise what they couldn't deliver. They didn't gamble on risky schemes. Workers knew their jobs were safe. Customers knew their goods would arrive. Banks knew Mercer debts would be honored. It was slow growth, but steady. And in a world addicted to speed, steadiness became a treasure. By the dawn of the 21st century, Mercer Freight had become a quiet giant. Not the biggest, not the flashiest, but respected everywhere. Their containers moved through ports in Shanghai and Rotterdam. Their trucks rumbled down American interstates. Their trains still thundered across the plains. And in boardrooms, whenever talk turned to expansion, mergers, or shortcuts, the old creed was pulled out like scripture. A company without trust is a wagon without wheels. But perhaps the most remarkable thing wasn't the money, though Mercer counted billions by then. It was the loyalty. Whole towns had grown up around Mercer depots. Generations of families had worked for the company, passing down stories of Clint like family scripture. Even in the digital age, drivers spoke his name with respect, as if he still rode with them on long hauls. And whenever a crisis shook the world, from the crash of 2008 to the supply chain chaos of pandemics, Mercer Freight was there. Not perfect, not immune, but present. Their ships docked, their trucks rolled, their rails sang. Customers who had been burned by fast-talking rivals came back, whispering the old saying like a prayer, "If Mercer carries it, it'll get there." So the story of Clint Mercer didn't end in the dust of wagon trails. It stretched across centuries, growing from mule trains to motor trucks, from rail cars to shipping containers, from handshakes under lantern light to contracts signed across oceans. And through it all, the creed held steady, whispered from campfires to boardrooms. We don't chase shine, we carry steady. Some say Clint Ghost still rides with his company, not on horseback anymore, but in the rumble of a freight train at night, in the hum of a truck engine on a rainy highway, in the whistle of a ship leaving harbor. He rides wherever trust is kept, wherever a promise is honored. And maybe that's the real wealth he left behind, not the ledgers, not the gold, but the proof that a man and a company can build something greater than fortune, a legacy of faith, steady as the beat of hooves on the trail. Now the years have rolled on, and the Mercer name still rolls with them. The wagons have long since vanished, rails stretch further than Clint ever dreamed, and skies hum with cargo planes bearing his emblem. Yet if you sit down with any Mercer hand, be he truck driver, dock worker, or suit in the boardroom, he'll tell you the same tale. Clint Mercer didn't leave us money, he left us method. That method was never about speed or flash. It was about delivering what you promised, no matter the weather, no matter the cost. A creed like that don't show up in quarterly earnings, but you'll find it in the way customers return year after year, and in the way employees stay long enough to raise families off a steady paycheck. See, in the end, wealth ain't the gold coins clinking in your pocket. Wealth is the peace that comes when folks know they can trust you. It's the quiet strength of having a reputation so solid, storms can't wash it away. Clint understood that. He saw money as the byproduct, not the prize. The prize was honor, keeping your word like a horse keeps its stride. They're a story Mercer men still whisper round truck stops and port taverns. They say one foggy night in the late 2000s, a driver named Carl broke down outside Denver with a load of medical supplies bound for a children's hospital. Storm was rolling in, snow already covering the highways. Dispatch asked if he wanted to wait it out. Carl shook his head. Kids don't wait on storms. So he chained his tires, coaxed that engine up icy grades, and rolled into the hospital dock just before dawn. Nurses wept as they unloaded the cargo, knowing the medicine would save lives. Carl didn't think it special, he just said, "That the Mercer way." And in that moment, every ghost of the trail, Clint, the first wagons, the lantern-lit depots seemed to ride with him. Now folks these days chase quick riches like tumbleweeds in the wind. They think fortune a lottery ticket, not a long trail. They want the shine, not the steady. And many burn out quick, leaving behind ashes where dreams once stood. But those who study Mercer Freight learn something different. They learn that patience, grit, and faith can build wealth deeper than any gold rush. They learn that slow steps, taken honest, will carry you further than any wild sprint. And they learn the truest secret of all, that money itself don't bring sleep at night. But trust, earned and kept, will let a man rest easy under the stars. Sometimes, late at night, engineers riding long rails swear they hear hoofbeats alongside their trains. Truckers rumbling down wet highways claim a shadow rides in their mirrors. Sailors on container ships, far out at sea, sometimes hear a low whistle carrying across the waves. They say at Clint Mercer, still riding watch, making sure the freight rolls on. Not for profit, not for glory, but because a promise was made, and a Mercer don't break promises. So if you're listening now, with rain tapping soft on the window, or fire crackling low in the pit, take this lesson with you. Fortune favors the steady hand. Success comes not from chasing shine, but from carrying steady, day after day, mile after mile, through storms, through quiet, through all the long roads of life. And if ever you find yourself weary, tempted to quit, remember the old creed. We don't chase shine, we carry steady. That creed built wagons from dust, rails from iron, ships from steel, and wealth from faith. It can build your life too if you let it. And maybe, just maybe, when you've walked your trail true and left behind more trust than treasure, you'll hear those hoofbeats on the wind. A cowboy ghost, riding eternal, nodding in quiet respect. That'll be Clint Mercer, tip of his hat, riding on. Clint Mercer's name became more than a story, it became a compass. Generations passed, steel towers rose where wooden depots once stood, and yet the Mercer creed guided each new hand that joined the outfit. In time, the company moved into spaces Clint never imagined. Logistics software, global air routes, and ocean trade corridors, all stitched together with the same care a cowboy once gave to mending leather tack. Some said Mercer Freight wasn't just moving cargo anymore, it was moving the heartbeat of commerce itself. But here the part worth remembering, no matter how far the reach, every manager was told the same words on their first day: don't chase shine, carry steady. And folks carried it in ways you wouldn't expect. There was a young accountant named Rosa, fresh from college, working long nights checking ledgers that stretched from Shanghai to Sao Paulo. One evening she spotted a slip. Not big, not flashy, but a small discrepancy that could have grown into a heap of trouble down the trail. Instead of sweeping it quiet, Rosa raised the alarm. Some thought she was foolish, risking her neck over pennies. But upper brass remembered the Mercer way. They dug deep, found a pattern, and caught a whole chain of fraud before it could bleed the company dry. When they asked Rosa why she spoke up, she shrugged. You told me steady hands matter more than shine. I figured telling the truth was steady. She didn't know it, but in that moment, Rosa was riding the same trail Clint rode, guarding more than freight, guarding trust. And then there was Malik, a truck driver hauling the night shift from Houston to El Paso. Storm tore across the desert, rain hitting the cab like gravel, roads half washed away. Dispatch called, asking if he'd wait till morning. Malik's voice came calm. Can't. Cargo oxygen tanks. They're bound for a hospital. So he eased that rig along, slow and sure, white lines vanishing under sheets of rain. By dawn, he rolled into El Paso, tired but proud, watching doctors rush to unload the tanks. Later, he sat in the break room, coffee steam rising around him. It wasn't about heroics, he told the others. It was about doing what Mercer hands have always done. At the heart of this saga, friend, it ain't about wealth stacking up like poker chips. It's about people standing tall in small moments, choosing faith over flash, steady over shiny. Wealth followed, sure enough, fortunes so wide they stretched across oceans, but the true inheritance was grit. Even outsiders noticed. Wall Street analysts scratched their heads, wondering why Mercer Freight kept thriving while others fell to pieces. They wrote reports about efficiency, technology, market timing. But those who knew the old story smiled quiet. It wasn't spreadsheets or apps. It was a promise made long ago by a cowboy who rode steady. Now let me tell you something that don't show up in any balance sheet. Some nights, in the big Mercer Tower, janitors claim they hear hoofbeats on the marble floor. Security guards on graveyard shift swear they see a shadow leaning near the elevators, hat tipped low. And out in the yards, when rain coming hard and trailers line up like cattle waiting for feed, drivers talk about a figure on horseback riding slow between the rigs, checking each one like he's still keeping watch. Folks don't spook easy in this line of work. They just nod and say, Clint's still here, making sure promises get kept. So if you're sitting here, listening by firelight or drifting towards sleep with rain against your window, take this lesson with you. Don't measure your wealth by the shine of coins or the noise of applause. Measure it by the steadiness of your hand, the faithfulness of your word, and the trust others place in you. For when storms come, and storms always come, it won't be shine that carries you. It'll be the steady step, mile after mile, promise after promise, that gets you home. And if you keep to that creed, maybe someday you'll hear those hoofbeats yourself, steady as rain, steady as trust. That where the trail wends for now, friend, a story of legacy, trust, and slow-built fortune under the wide eternal sky. Years rolled on, and Mercer Freight became more than just a company. It was a tradition, a whisper passed from hand to hand, like the way cowboys once taught their sons to ride or mend a fence line. Folks said if you looked close enough at any office, truck yard, or dock, you'd find the same quiet grit that Clint Mercer had carried through the dust. The world itself was changing, faster than a wild Mustang breaking free from rope. Planes lifted cargo across oceans in half a day. Satellites tracked shipments with pinpoint eyes. But even with all that glittering progress, the heartbeat of Mercer Freight didn't change. Steady hands, honest deals, and promises kept, those were the lodestars. One such promise fell on the shoulders of Eleanor, a young executive sent to oversee operations in South America. She wasn't no cowboy,
but her folks back home worked ranches, and grit was in her blood. Down in the ports, she found corruption running deep as the river officials demanding bribes, paperwork tangled like barbed wire, and competitors cutting corners to shave time. Eleanor could have bent with the wind, would have been easy, even profitable, to pay the bribes and move freight faster, but she remembered the story she'd heard on her first day. Clint Mercer didn't chase shine, he carried steady, so she pushed back, refusing every bribe, even when delays stacked high as mountains. For months, profits dipped, shareholders muttered, but Eleanor held steady, knowing trust was worth more than shine. And in time, word spread. Customers realized Mercer shipments, though sometimes slower, never went missing, never got stuck, never came with hidden fees. Contracts grew, and the port itself slowly cleaned house, following the standard she'd set. Eleanor didn't just guard the company wealth, she raised the bar for an entire trade corridor. Another story came from Samuel, an old truck mechanic in Kansas City. He'd been with the outfit 40 years, grease under his nails and the steady rhythm of wrenches in his hands. Folks laughed, saying he was past his prime, but Samuel kept showing up before dawn, checking brakes, oil, and bolts. One winter night, he caught a crack in a trailer axle just hours before it was due to roll. To most, it looked small, easy to ignore, but Samuel's hands knew better. He called it out, and they swapped the part. That rig was bound for the Rockies. A snowstorm hit, and had that axle failed, drivers and cargo both could have been lost. Samuel never bragged. He just wiped his hands, sipped his coffee, and said, "Steady don't always look pretty, but it sure saves lives." Mercer Freight thrived not because of one man wealth, but because of 1,000 small acts of steadiness stacked like bricks in a wall. And yet, wealth did come. Shareholders smiled at their dividends. Workers saw fair pay in their pockets. Communities where Mercer built yards or offices found schools funded, roads fixed, and hospitals supplied. But here the curious thing, no one toasted just the numbers. They toasted the spirit. When the company marked its 100th year, employees gathered under a wide tent in Texas. Rain poured outside, drums on canvas, but inside the air was warm with stories. Drivers spoke of long hauls, clerks of balancing ledgers, managers of storms weathered. At the end, an old cowboy hat was placed on a stand. Nobody knew for sure if it was Clint, but folks bowed their heads just the same. Not to worship a man, but to honor a way of life that said wealth ain't flash, but the trail you leave behind. Even as the company reached farther, whispers of the founder lingered. Pilots claimed, on rare nights, to see a lone rider below as they soared across desert skies. Dock workers swore they heard spurs on steel decks when shipments were late, only for things to sort themselves out come morning. And maybe that was just tired minds spinning tales. But maybe, just maybe, the spirit of a man who chose steadiness over shine was still riding, keeping watch. So if you find yourself restless tonight, listening to rain or the crackle of a fire, take heart in the Mercer way. You ain't got to be rich to be wealthy. Wealth is the peace in knowing your word is good, the trust others place in your hands, and the trail you blaze steady as a horse gait. When storms come, as they always do, it ain't gold that'll carry you through. It grit, it honesty, it the courage to do the right thing when no one watching. And who knows, if you keep that creed, maybe one night you'll hear hoofbeats, faint and steady, reminding you that some promises last longer than lifetimes.
The lantern of prosperity. The rain tapped gently against the roof of the small cabin, each droplet creating a rhythm that soothed the restless mind. A fire crackled warmly in the stone hearth, filling the room with a glow that danced across the wooden walls. Sitting close to the fire was Daniel, a man in his early 30s whose eyes carried both a quiet determination and the weight of unspoken questions. Daniel had not grown up with wealth. His childhood was filled with moments of scarcity, where each dollar mattered, and small luxuries felt like distant dreams. But those years had also taught him resilience, and as he sat by the fire, listening to the rain, he knew one truth clearly. Wealth was not just about money, it was about freedom, choice, and peace of mind. The fire popped and sparked, and Daniel thought about the long road ahead. He had debts, obligations, and a career that offered stability but not fulfillment. Yet, something inside him refused to settle. He wanted more, not out of greed, but out of a deep desire to live intentionally, to build a future where nights like these would be free of worry. So, on that rainy evening, Daniel began his journey. He opened a worn notebook, its cover frayed and corners bent, and he wrote down his first commitment. I will build wealth steadily, patiently, and wisely. My story begins tonight. He had no blueprint, no guarantee of success, only the spark of determination and the comfort of the fire beside him. The rain outside fell like an encouraging whisper, as though the world itself wanted him to begin. Daniel's first steps were small. He started by observing his own spending habits. Every purchase, every subscription, every forgotten bill was tracked. It was eye-opening. He realized how easily money slipped away, not in grand expenses, but in tiny, careless choices. Rather than feeling shame, he felt empowered. Each dollar saved became a seed planted, a reminder that discipline could transform his future. He canceled what he didn't need, cooked at home more often, and found joy in simplicity. It wasn't about deprivation, it was about clarity. Slowly, his savings grew. With that came the realization that simply saving would not be enough. Money left idle would erode over time, losing value against inflation. It needed purpose. It needed to work. On another quiet night, with rain once again drumming against the cabin roof, Daniel began to study the world of investing. He read about index funds, compounding interest, and the timeless patience required to let wealth mature. The fire burned low as he took notes, each page of his journal filling with possibilities. He started small, investing just enough to learn without fear. Each contribution to his portfolio felt like adding kindling to a growing fire, small, steady, and purposeful. The months passed, and Daniel encountered his first true challenge. An unexpected expense, a broken car transmission, threatened to undo his progress. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was this path worth it? Was he chasing something unattainable? But he remembered the promise he had written on that first rainy night. He wasn't chasing sudden riches, he was building a foundation. So he adjusted, created an emergency fund, and carried on. The setback became a lesson. Resilience mattered just as much as discipline. As seasons changed, Daniel found mentors. Some came through books, their words carrying wisdom across generations. Others came from conversations with colleagues and friends who had quietly built their own stability. Their stories reassured him wealth was possible, but it demanded consistency, patience, and courage. He began to dream bigger. A side business sparked from a skill he had long overlooked, writing clear, practical guides for people struggling with finances. It started as a hobby but soon became a steady stream of income. By the firelight, he worked late into the evenings, the sound of rain outside blending with the scratching of his pen. This was no longer just about money, it was about agency, about shaping life on his own terms. Daniel smiled as he realized that he was not only growing financially, but also personally. The rain eased into a drizzle, and the fire dimmed into glowing embers. Daniel leaned back, feeling a calm satisfaction. His journey was still at the beginning, but he knew one truth for certain. Every storm passes, every fire burns low. But with patience and care, both returned stronger. He closed his journal, whispering to himself, "Wealth is not a destination. It is a path I walk, step by step, rain by rain, fire by fire." And with that, Daniel drifted into peaceful sleep, the sound of rainfall guiding him into dreams of possibility. The following weeks were filled with quiet determination. Daniel noticed that every rainy night seemed to invite him deeper into his work, as though the rhythm of the storm gave him permission to focus inward. The firelight, soft and steady, mirrored the slow but undeniable growth of his savings and investments. One evening, while sipping tea by the window, Daniel received a letter from his old friend Clara. She had moved to another city years ago, chasing her own dreams in entrepreneurship. Clara's words carried a mixture of excitement and honesty. Her business had nearly failed twice, but through perseverance it had finally begun to thrive. Her letter struck something within him. Clara's success was not built on luck, but on persistence, creativity, and the willingness to face failure without surrender. That night, Daniel reread her words several times, letting the message sink in. The path to prosperity is rarely smooth, but it is always walkable if you keep moving. With renewed inspiration, Daniel expanded his side business. What had begun as a few financial guides grew into a series of articles, then workshops, then small group sessions held online. He didn't just talk about money, he told stories, weaving in his own lessons learned through storms and firelight. People connected to his sincerity, and slowly, his audience grew. Rain whispered against the cabin roof as he spoke to strangers from across the country, their voices mingling over the internet while the glow of the fireplace grounded him in the present.
His once humble journal became filled with notes from conversations, feedback, and insights. Yet success did not come without doubt. One night, exhaustion caught up with him. He stared at his numbers, income, savings, investments, and felt they were too small compared to the vastness of his dreams. Fear whispered, "What if this is all for nothing? What if you never reach the freedom you seek?" Daniel closed his eyes and leaned closer to the fire. The flames flickered like fragile hopes, bending but never breaking. He remembered his first promise, written in shaky ink, steadily, patiently, wisely. Success wasn't measured in how quickly wealth appeared, it was measured in the quiet courage to keep going. The next morning he walked outside after the storm had passed. The ground was damp, the air smelled of earth and renewal. Birds sang gently from the trees. It reminded him that even the heaviest rain nourishes the soil beneath. His efforts too were seeds being watered, unseen for now but destined to bloom in time. From that moment, Daniel shifted his focus. Instead of chasing quick progress, he began to build habits that would last a lifetime. Every morning he dedicated a few minutes to reading, finance, philosophy, biographies of those who had walked this path before him. Every evening he wrote in his journal, not just about numbers, but about gratitude, discipline, and hope. Slowly, wealth began to take on a new meaning. It wasn't only in his bank account or portfolio, it was in his health, his relationships, his peace of mind. Wealth was sitting by the fire without anxiety. Wealth was hearing the rain and feeling comfort rather than worry. Years passed quietly, each season marking growth in ways both visible and unseen. His side business became steady income, his investments multiplied patiently, and his emergency fund gave him security. Clara visited one autumn, bringing with her the laughter of old friendship. Together they shared stories by the fire, speaking not just of money but of freedom, of choices, of building lives that felt meaningful. Daniel realized then that true wealth was never about competing with others. It was about creating harmony between your needs, your dreams, and your actions. The rain returned that evening, drumming gently as the fire glowed golden between them, and in that moment he felt it, the quiet fulfillment of a man who had not yet finished his journey, but who had already found peace in walking it. The days grew shorter as winter pressed itself gently over the land. Daniel's cabin, tucked at the edge of the forest, seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the seasons. He had grown accustomed to the solitude, not as loneliness, but as a companion. Each evening when the sky turned indigo and rain brushed softly against the roof, he would settle near the fire with his journal open, a pen in hand, and a mug of tea steaming beside him. Wealth, he had discovered, was not simply about numbers written in ledgers or glowing on a computer screen. Wealth was the sound of steady rain when debts no longer haunted him. Wealth was being able to choose silence over chaos, peace over stress. But still, the journey was ongoing, and Daniel knew that to stop learning, to stop moving forward, would be to let the storms of life sweep away the foundation he had carefully built. It was during one of those quiet evenings that Clara returned with an idea. She had long been his friend and his inspiration, and her entrepreneurial ventures had taken her far beyond what Daniel once thought possible. She suggested they collaborate, combining her expertise in business with his growing reputation for thoughtful financial guidance. At first, Daniel hesitated. Doubt crept in like the chill of winter air sneaking through a cracked window. Could he truly take this next step? Would people listen to him? The fire crackled as though answering his question. Daniel smiled faintly at the thought. How many times had he sat here, seeking answers in the flames? He remembered his earliest nights, when fear told him he was destined to fail. Back then, he had pushed forward anyway, step by step, and each time he did, the path ahead widened just enough for him to keep going. So, he said yes. Together, Daniel and Clara created a series of workshops, not flashy or loud, but gentle, deliberate, like conversations between friends. They spoke about financial freedom, about creating habits that lasted, about learning to see wealth as a form of peace rather than endless pursuit. And to Daniel's surprise, people came. Not in great crowds at first, but steadily, just as he had learned wealth itself grows, slowly, faithfully, like the roots of a tree beneath the soil. The rain outside often became the soundtrack to his work. During online sessions, he would sometimes hear the patter against his windows, and though his audience couldn't hear it, he felt it deep in the moment. Rain reminded him to speak softly, to pace his words, to let the lessons sink in like water seeping gently into earth. One evening, after a long day of teaching, Daniel returned to his cabin, weary but fulfilled. The firelight was waiting for him, glowing like an old friend. He sat down, opened his ledger, and reviewed his progress.
His emergency savings had grown far beyond what he once thought possible. His investments were compounding quietly, month after month, like invisible streams filling a hidden reservoir. His business, once just a side idea, now covered more than his living expenses. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt not just stable, but abundant. And yet, this abundance was not loud or overwhelming. It was steady, like the glow of embers late at night. It was quiet, like the sound of rain falling on the roof. Still, his heart told him the journey wasn't over. True wealth wasn't meant to be hoarded. It was meant to flow, to be shared. He remembered the villagers who had once helped him when he was just beginning, neighbors who offered advice, friends who encouraged him, strangers who believed in his small beginnings. Now it was his turn to give back. So Daniel started small. He began offering scholarships for those who couldn't afford his workshops. He donated to local schools, providing resources for financial education. He mentored young people, teaching them the same lessons he had once scribbled in his journal: discipline, patience, gratitude. The more he gave, the lighter he felt. Wealth was no longer a mountain to climb. It was a river to swim in, cool and refreshing, flowing onward to nourish others along its path. One spring evening, after a storm, Daniel walked outside and stood beneath the dripping trees. The forest smelled of renewal, the air fresh and alive. He closed his eyes and thought about his journey, the years of fear, the nights of doubt, the quiet victories, the friendships forged, the peace found. He realized then that he had built more than financial freedom. He had built a life that aligned with his deepest values, one that felt whole. And yet, what struck him most was not the wealth itself, but the rhythm of it, the way each season mirrored the process. Rain fell, nourishing the soil. Seeds took root. Growth was slow, invisible at first, but in time a harvest came, full and generous. So it was with his finances. So it was with his life. Later that night, sitting again by the fire, Daniel whispered to himself, patience, gratitude, consistency. These words had carried him from uncertainty into peace, and now they would carry him further still. Clara visited once more, and the two of them sat by the fire, the rain tapping gently above. She spoke of her own challenges, of the storm she had endured, and Daniel found himself nodding in understanding. They laughed, they shared dreams, they reflected on how far they had come, and in the glow of the firelight, Daniel saw that wealth was not something either of them possessed alone. It was something built in connection, in shared stories, in journeys walked side by side. As the night grew late, Daniel leaned back, eyes heavy with contentment. Outside, the storm continued, steady and soothing. The flames danced lower, but their warmth lingered. He felt the kind of peace that seeps deep into the soul, the kind that no amount of gold could buy. And as he drifted toward sleep, he knew that his story, like the rain, would continue. Not in rushing floods, but in steady drops, nourishing the earth of tomorrow. The summer months stretched long and golden, bringing with them a sense of expansion that matched the rhythm of Daniel's life. His cabin, once a simple shelter, had become both home and workshop. The windows were often open, letting in the breeze that carried the smell of pine and rain-damp earth. Mornings were bright, with light filtering through the trees, but the evenings remained his favorite. He would sit outside, a lantern at his side, listening to the cicadas and watching as stars pricked the velvet sky. It was during one of these evenings that Daniel received a letter from a young man named Samuel. The handwriting was careful but uncertain, as though each word had been weighed before being placed on paper. Samuel wrote of debt, of working long hours yet never feeling ahead, of lying awake at night with worry. Daniel recognized the fear in those words because once those same feelings had haunted him. He invited Samuel to visit, and a week later the young man arrived thin, pale, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. They sat by the fire, rain whispering against the roof, and Daniel listened. Samuel spoke of mistakes, credit cards used too freely, loans taken without understanding, the endless cycle of paying one bill while another waited. When he was finished, Daniel didn't scold or lecture. He simply nodded, then told Samuel his own story. The failures, the doubts, the long road back to peace. Together they drew up a plan, not a complicated one, but simple steps. Track every expense, build a small emergency fund, cut back on what wasn't needed, and focus on steady progress. Daniel gave Samuel one of his old journals, its first pages filled with notes from years ago when he had been lost himself. Start here, Daniel said gently. Write down everything, even the smallest thing. And remember, progress isn't about perfection, it's about patience. Samuel stayed for several days, helping with chores around the cabin, walking with Daniel through the forest, learning how to slow his thoughts enough to see clearly. By the time he left, his eyes were brighter, his shoulders lighter. He promised to write again, and Daniel believed him.
Weeks later, another letter arrived. Samuel had begun saving, even if only a little. He had canceled unnecessary expenses. He was paying down debts one at a time. The path was long, but he had taken his first steps, and for the first time in years, he felt hope. Daniel smiled as he read. The rain pattered outside, steady and calm, and he thought about how hope was a form of wealth too, perhaps the most important kind. Money mattered, yes, but without hope, even riches could feel empty. As summer waned into autumn, more people began seeking Daniel guidance. Word of his workshops had spread, and though he never sought fame, his quiet approach resonated with those who had grown tired of endless noise and shallow promises. They came not just to learn about money, but to sit in the quiet glow of his presence, to feel the reassurance that change was possible. Some nights, when the cabin was full, Daniel would take his guests outside to the fire pit. They would gather around the flames, rain tapping on the trees above, and he would tell them stories. Not of numbers and charts, but of patience, of persistence, of finding balance. He spoke of his own mistakes, of how fear once controlled him, and how little by little he had replaced fear with discipline, and discipline with peace. The firelight danced across their faces, and Daniel knew these moments were as valuable as any lesson he could ever teach. For in the glow of the fire, surrounded by the sound of rain, people felt safe enough to imagine a better future. And that imagining was the beginning of transformation. Through it all, Daniel kept learning too. Wealth, he realized, wasn't a finish line. It was a living thing, like the forest that surrounded him. It needed tending, care, and respect. It grew best when nurtured with gratitude, and it thrived when shared. On a crisp evening in late autumn, Daniel sat alone by the fire, journal in hand. He reflected on the year, the letters received, the people helped, the quiet growth of his own finances. His investments continued to grow, his savings were strong, his business sustainable. Yet the true wealth he felt was not the numbers, but the stories. Samuel finding hope, Clara building with him, strangers becoming friends. The rain began to fall softly, and Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes. The rhythm of it merged with the crackle of the fire, a lullaby of earth and flame. He realized then that his story was no longer just his own, it was part of something larger, a tapestry of lives connected by shared struggles and shared victories. He wrote in his journal, "Wealth is not owned, it is experienced. It is not about holding, but about flowing. The river gives life because it moves. The fire burned lower, but its warmth remained. Outside, the rain fell steady, washing the world clean for tomorrow." And in that moment, Daniel knew he had everything he needed. Winter settled over the forest like a heavy blanket, softening every sound beneath its weight. Snow fell quietly at night, covering the trees and paths in white, while the lake froze over in a glassy sheet. For Daniel, this season was always one of reflection. The world slowed, and in that slowness he found space to look inward. Each morning he lit a fire in the cabin hearth and brewed a pot of tea, steam rising into the chill. As the flames warmed the room, he would sit at his desk, writing letters, updating his journals, or reading old notes. More letters arrived during those months, each one carrying stories of struggle, determination, and small victories. There was Hannah, a single mother who had been working 2 jobs to keep her children fed. She wrote of exhaustion, but also of resolve. Daniel remembered the weariness in her words and responded with compassion, sending not just advice but encouragement. He told her to focus on building stability step by step, to celebrate each small win, and to never forget that her persistence was itself an act of love. Months later, she wrote again, her tone lighter. She had managed to save her first emergency fund. It was small, but it represented a turning point. There was also Victor, a retired man who feared his savings wouldn't last. His anxiety was palpable, each sentence weighed down by uncertainty. Daniel reminded him that wealth was not only measured in dollars but also in perspective. Together they sketched out a plan, lowering unnecessary expenses, shifting to safer investments, and, most importantly, creating peace of mind. Victor's final letter that winter was short but full of gratitude. He could sleep at night again, and that, Daniel thought, was worth more than gold. The snow piled higher outside and the nights grew longer. Sometimes Daniel walked through the forest with only the crunch of his boots beneath him and the glow of a lantern to light the way. He found these walks calming, almost meditative, and often, the best ideas came to him during these solitary journeys. One night, as he stood at the frozen edge of the lake, he realized something profound. People did not seek him merely for financial advice. What they truly sought was reassurance, a voice reminding them that it was not too late to change, that hope could be rebuilt, that wealth could be more than numbers. His story, his patience, and his willingness to listen were the bridges they needed.
With this realization, Daniel decided to expand his efforts. He began recording his teachings, speaking softly by the fire with rain sounds playing in the background, capturing the same atmosphere his visitors loved. These recordings were shared quietly at first, sent only to those who had written him letters, but soon they began to spread further. He did not seek fame, yet his words reached far beyond the forest. People listened as they fell asleep, soothed not only by the rhythm of his voice, but by the calmness of his message. They imagined the crackle of the fire, the whisper of rain, and the quiet presence of someone who understood. As weeks passed, Daniel continued to balance his own financial life with teaching others. His investments remained steady, his savings grew, and yet his focus was never on accumulation alone. He thought often of a principle that had guided him for years: invest in wealth as a tool, not a trophy. It is meant to be used, not worshipped. The winter months, though harsh, became some of the most fulfilling of his life. He hosted small gatherings at the cabin, even as snowstorm winds howled outside. Guests sat close to the fire, wrapped in blankets, sipping warm tea as Daniel spoke. He would tell them stories of failure turned into resilience, of fear transformed into patience, of dreams rebuilt slowly over time. He never spoke with urgency. His tone was always gentle, as if reminding them that change didn't need to be dramatic to be powerful. The fire glowed, the snow pressed against the windows, and rain, sometimes sleet, sometimes melting snow, tapped softly against the roof. One evening, as the storm raged harder than usual, a young woman named Lena stayed behind after the others had left. She confessed that her fear was not about money itself, but about worth. She worried that her mistakes defined her, that she would never rise above them. Daniel listened in silence for a long while before responding. "Mistakes are not walls," he said softly. "They are stepping stones. Each one shows you where not to place your foot again, and each one, no matter how painful, brings you closer to stability." Lena wept, but they were quiet tears, the kind that carry release rather than despair. By the time she left, she walked with her head a little higher, her steps a little steadier. That night, after she was gone, Daniel returned to his journal. He wrote about the lesson he himself had just realized. Often, the greatest gift one can give is not a plan nor a strategy, but the reminder that dignity can be restored, no matter how lost it feels. The fire burned low, the snow continued to fall, and Daniel smiled to himself. The cabin was quiet, but not lonely. In his heart, he carried the stories of so many people, each of them on their own journey, each of them slowly building peace. He closed his journal with a final thought for the night. Wealth begins with the courage to believe again. As spring slowly approached, the snow melted into streams that fed the river winding past the cabin. The days grew longer, light returning to the forest, and with it, new energy. Daniel noticed how the earth itself seemed to breathe more freely, as though relieved after months of holding still beneath ice. He carried this same sense of renewal into his work. With the warmer weather, more travelers made their way to his cabin, some from nearby towns, others from much farther away. Word of mouth had spread about the man in the woods who spoke of money not as a cold calculation, but as a living tool, something that could support dreams rather than crush them. One of the first visitors of spring was a man named Gregory. He arrived with a tired expression, his shoulders slumped from years of labor. Gregory had been running a small carpentry business, but the debts weighed heavy, and he feared he would never recover. Sitting by the fire, with rain pattering softly against the cabin roof, Gregory spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. He confessed that he had stopped dreaming years ago, focusing only on survival. Daniel listened, nodding slowly, allowing silence to rest between them. "The work of your hands," he said finally, "is valuable, but you must let your work serve you, not consume you. Build structure around it, simplify what you offer, price fairly, and honor your limits. A business is not only about growth, it is also about balance." Together, they outlined a new plan. Gregory would scale back, focus on his best pieces rather than trying to do everything, and slowly climb out of debt. The relief on his face was unmistakable. It wasn't a miracle solution, but it was a way forward, one step, one plank, one table at a time. As Gregory left, Daniel felt once again that his role was not to hand out riches, but to clear the fog from weary minds, allowing others to see paths that had been hidden. Later that week, a family arrived, parents with 2 young children, nervous but hopeful. They confessed they had little savings, and yet their dream was to own a home where their children could grow without the shadow of constant rent increases. Daniel knelt beside the children, offering them cups of warm tea while their parents explained their struggles.
He did not dismiss their dream as impossible. Instead, he guided them to break it down into steps, first building an emergency fund, then securing stable work, then slowly setting aside savings for a down payment. He explained that even the largest trees in the forest began as seeds. When the family left, the parents held each other's hands more tightly. Their path would not be easy, but it was visible now, no longer hidden behind doubt. That evening, Daniel returned to his journal, noting a thought that had grown clearer with each visitor. Wealth is not just about possession, it is about direction. Even those who have little can move steadily toward a dream if they believe the path exists. As spring deepened, the rains grew heavier. Nights were filled with the rhythm of water on the roof, a sound that Daniel found deeply comforting. He often sat in silence, listening, allowing the sound to carry away any lingering heaviness in his chest. It reminded him of the simple truth he tried to share with others: peace could be found in small, steady rhythms. Letters continued to arrive as well. Some were updates filled with gratitude, others were pleas for guidance, voices written in ink from people who had never stepped into the forest but somehow felt connected to his story. One evening, he received a letter from a young man named Raphael, who had left his hometown to chase fast wealth through risky investments. The letter was filled with regret, lost savings, broken trust, friendships strained. Raphael admitted he had been blinded by the promise of quick success, and now he felt ruined. Daniel read the letter by firelight, pausing to consider his response. He remembered his own youth when he too had sought shortcuts, only to learn that shortcuts often lead in circles. His reply was simple: Raphael, wealth built slowly becomes the foundation of peace. Let this loss be your teacher, not your jailer. Begin again. Not with urgency, but with care. Save small amounts. Work honestly. Trust in the long path. The world will not close its doors to you. Weeks later, a second letter arrived from Raphael, his tone calmer. He had found work again, steady though modest. He had begun to save a little each week, and though the amounts were small, he felt dignity returning. Daniel folded the letter with a quiet smile. To him, it was proof that recovery was always possible when one was willing to begin again with patience. By the time summer arrived, the forest was alive with green, and Daniel Hivan gatherings grew larger. Sometimes 10 or more people would sit outside the cabin as fireflies flickered in the warm night air. They would listen as Daniel spoke not in lectures but in stories of men and women like Gregory, Lena, Hannah, and Raphael. Each story reminded them that failure was not final, that wealth was not merely numbers, and that peace could be built with steady hands. The children often fell asleep by the fire, lulled by the sound of rain and the gentle cadence of Daniel's voice. Adults lingered long after, speaking quietly with him, carrying hope back into their own lives. And through it all, Daniel remained grateful, not for riches, but for the chance to transform hardship into guidance, to let his own past mistakes ripple outward as lessons for others. The forest, the rain, and the fire had become companions in this journey, creating the perfect stage for reflection and renewal. One night, as thunder rolled gently in the distance, Daniel wrote in his journal, "If I have learned one truth, it is this: wealth is not measured in gold, but in peace carried quietly through each season of life." The days of summer grew long, and the forest thrived in golden light. Daniel often woke to birdsong and the gentle hum of bees moving from flower to flower, yet as vibrant as the world around him seemed, many of the people who came to his cabin carried storms inside them. Their lives were marked not by seasons of abundance, but by years of worry, scarcity, and cycles they could not seem to escape. One humid afternoon, a young woman named Clara arrived, her boots damp from walking the rain-soaked trail. She was quiet at first, sitting across from Daniel as the fire crackled between them. It took time before her words emerged, halting but heavy. Clara explained that she had inherited a small sum of money after her parents passed away. At first, she thought it was the key to freedom, a blessing that could change everything. But within a year, most of it was gone. Friends had borrowed without returning, poor investments had swallowed large chunks, and her own impulse spending had drained the rest. Now she was left with regret and a hollow feeling that she had failed those who entrusted her with their legacy. Daniel stirred the fire gently, watching sparks rise into the air before he spoke. "Clara," he said softly, "money can vanish, but wisdom remains. You carry the lesson now, and lessons, unlike coins, do not disappear. Do not despise what is gone. Honor it by using what you have learned to build again." Her eyes welled with tears, but she nodded. Daniel showed her how to track her income, create small savings goals, and protect her money through clear boundaries. It was not about rebuilding the lost inheritance, it was about building herself. That night, Clara slept near the fire, rain tapping steadily on the cabin roof. When she left in the morning, her steps were lighter. Daniel knew she would stumble at times, but he also knew she carried a seed of resilience that had been buried until now. Later in the season, a traveler named Victor arrived, a man in his late 40s with lines of weariness etched across his face. He had worked for decades in a demanding job, providing for his family, but now his children were grown and he felt empty. Though his savings were respectable, he confessed he had no idea how to truly live. Daniel listened as Victor explained how money had become the sole measure of his worth. Every year had been about saving more, climbing higher, and yet here he sat, restless, unfulfilled. The measure of wealth, Daniel said, is not only in what you gather, but in what you release. You have built stability. Now you must ask, what joy will you allow yourself to experience? What will you give, not because you must, but because you can? They spoke for hours, the sound of rain threading through their conversation. Victor realized that his wealth had never been meant to sit silent. It was meant to move, to create, to bless. He left with plans not only to travel, but to quietly support young apprentices in his trade, giving them opportunities he had never received. Daniel felt a quiet satisfaction watching Victor disappear down the path because he knew that wealth, when shared with purpose, became something far greater than numbers in an account. It became legacy. The summer continued, and so did the visitors. Some came with financial troubles, others with emotional burdens, but all sought clarity. Daniel found that often the solution was not complicated strategy, but a change in perspective. He reminded people that money should never become the master, it was only a servant. In the evenings, he wrote reflections in his journal, words that might someday guide someone even when he was gone. He wrote about Clara, who learned that failure could be a teacher. He wrote about Victor, who discovered joy through giving. He wrote about the countless letters he received from strangers who shared their struggles and triumphs, and how each one revealed the same truth. Wealth was not about escape from hardship, but about creating space for peace within it. One particularly stormy night, lightning flashed beyond the cabin windows as thunder rolled through the forest. Daniel sat by the fire, lost in thought. He realized that he had become a kind of bridge, a point between despair and hope, confusion and clarity. He was not solving lives, but he was offering lanterns to light the way. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, the glow of the fire and the steady beat of rain created a sanctuary. Daniel closed his journal with a sense of deep gratitude. He had once feared that his own mistakes with money would haunt him forever, but now those mistakes had become the very stones that built this path. As he drifted to sleep to the rhythm of the rain, he knew the forest would bring more travelers tomorrow, and he would be ready. Not with perfect answers, but with patient ears, warm firelight, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from walking through storms and finding calm on the other side. The autumn winds crept into the forest, carrying with them a crispness that made the nights longer and the fires burn brighter. Daniel felt the shift in the air as surely as he felt the shift within the travelers who arrived at his door. Each season, it seemed, pulled new people toward his cabin, each carrying burdens that weighed heavier than the packs on their backs. One evening, as the rain came down in sheets, a knock echoed at the door. Standing outside was a man named Jonah, dripping wet, his coat torn from the brambles. Daniel welcomed him inside, offering a seat by the fire and a warm bowl of stew. Slowly, Jonah shared his story. He had once been a thriving entrepreneur, running a chain of small shops across the countryside. At first, his work had been honest, his heart aligned with the joy of providing goods for his neighbors. But greed had crept in, subtle as a shadow. He expanded too quickly, borrowed too heavily, and began cutting corners. When the market shifted, his empire collapsed, leaving him bankrupt and bitter. "I ruined not only myself," Jonah said, voice cracking, "but the people who trusted me. My employees lost their jobs, my customers felt betrayed. I walk now, not to seek fortune, but to run from the shame." Daniel poked the fire thoughtfully. "Jonah," he said, "perhaps your wealth was not lost, it was transformed. You now carry the wealth of understanding, of humility. What you build next may not be shops or coins, but trust. And trust, when earned back, is worth more than gold." Jonah sat quietly for a long while, the rain a steady drum outside. In the flicker of firelight, his weary face softened. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps redemption was not impossible. Not long after Jonah departed, another traveler came, a young teacher named Marisol. She was small in stature but carried a determination in her eyes that was impossible to ignore. She told Daniel of her dream to create a school in her village that would teach not only reading and writing but also financial literacy. "Too many in my village," she explained, "grow up with empty purses because no one ever teaches them how to hold on to wealth or how to use it wisely. They know how to work hard but not how to make their work endure." Daniel listened with admiration. Knowledge, he said, is a form of currency that never depreciates. If you plant seeds of wisdom in young hearts, you will grow a harvest that feeds generations. They spent the evening drawing plans using scraps of parchment and charcoal. Daniel showed her how to create lessons from simple examples, saving with pebbles, understanding interest with grains of rice, showing the danger of debt with cups of water that overflowed when poured too quickly. By dawn, Marisol had a full vision, practical, clear, and rooted in hope. She left the cabin with a new resolve, the rain easing as though the skies themselves were blessing her journey. The weeks rolled on, and as leaves fell from the trees, Daniel found himself reflecting on the stories he had heard. Clara had written back to him, sharing that she was rebuilding her savings slowly but steadily, even beginning a small craft business. Victor sent word that he had sponsored 2 apprentices, both of whom were thriving. Jonah, too, had written, saying that he had returned to his old village not to rebuild an empire but to volunteer his skills for the local cooperative. Daniel realized something profound. The true measure of his own wealth was not in the coins he once hoarded, but in the lives he now touched. Each traveler carried a spark with them when they left, and those sparks were beginning to light fires across distant places. Winter came with its heavy snows, blanketing the forest in silence. Yet even in the deep cold, travelers still found their way to Daniel's cabin. Among them was an elderly woman named Ruth, whose hands trembled as she held her teacup. She confessed that she had lived her life always saving, always careful, always cautious. Her cupboards were full, her accounts untouched, but she had never once allowed herself to enjoy the fruits of her labor. Now, as her years dwindled, she feared she had lived a life of deprivation in the name of security. Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand gently. Ruth, he said, security is only half of wealth. The other half is joy. Do not let fear chain you in your final years. Spend not recklessly but freely. Share meals with friends. Travel if your body allows. Let your savings be converted into memories, laughter, and warmth. Tears welled in her eyes as the words sank in. She realized it was not too late. She could still dance, still give, still live. The following morning, she left with a smile, snow crunching under her boots as if each step carried newfound courage. Through these encounters, Daniel began to see himself not merely as a guide, but as a student too. Every traveler revealed a piece of the puzzle of wealth, failure, redemption, generosity, knowledge, and joy. The stories intertwined like threads of a tapestry, each one adding color and depth to his understanding. On one especially quiet night, Daniel sat alone by the fire, the wind howling outside. He thought of Elias, his old friend whose story had once been his own inspiration. Elias had found freedom not in riches but in simplicity and meaning. Daniel realized that he was now carrying forward that same flame, passing it from one weary traveler to the next. And so, as the fire burned low and the cabin filled with the gentle hush of snow, Daniel whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. He had once been lost, drowning in the weight of his own mistakes. Now he was found, not by riches, but by purpose. And in that purpose, he discovered a truth worth sharing under every storm, every night sky, every whispered story by the fire. Wealth is not a destination, but a journey. And for those who walk it with patience, humility, and courage, the journey itself becomes the treasure.